When you think of depression, you probably think sadness, right? But what if I told you 2025 brain imaging studies suggest that guilt may actually be one of the central forces driving depressive symptoms? And not just guilt over mistakes, guilt over everything. The brain regions that usually help put guilt into perspective aren't firing the way they should. This means someone can feel like a failure simply for forgetting their keys. Let's break down how this psychological distortion not only explains chronic self-blame, but also why so many symptoms fly under the radar. Depression doesn't always look sad. When you picture depression, do you see a character in a movie crying in bed or staring blankly out a rainy window? That's the image most of us have absorbed, from films, shows, even campaigns that reduce it to sadness or a dramatic breakdown. But here's the complication. The newest 2025 data paints a picture that looks very different, and it shows us why clinging to that traditional image can cause so many people to slip through the cracks without anyone noticing. The research indicates that over 60% of depression cases actually don't present themselves in clinics through sadness at all. Instead, many show up because of other symptoms that traditionally weren't thought of as core markers of depression. That figure alone is enough to stop and think about, because it means more than half of individuals struggling may be presenting with signs that don't fit that media stereotype. When people assume depression looks only like despair or tears, they might miss what is happening right in front of them. Take irritability, for example. Health records from multiple psychiatric clinics show that people often come into appointments not because they feel sad, but because they describe themselves as being on edge, constantly losing patience, or finding themselves snapping at others. This isn't the emotional breakdown people usually associate with depression. It's a sharpness in tone, a quick fuse, and a sense of inattention. Imagine how easily that can be mistaken as bad temperament or a lack of self-control, when in reality, it can be a sign of a deeper mood disorder. Then there's cognitive disruption. Patients often describe being unable to concentrate, losing their train of thought during tasks, or struggling with decisions they would normally consider trivial. These disruptions can range from forgetting chores to difficulty organizing work responsibilities. What's fascinating about the data from 2025 is that these cognitive impairments aren't just a byproduct of stress or distraction. Brain imaging techniques suggest they stem from measurable differences in how working memory and executive function operate under depressive conditions. So while someone may look outwardly fine, inside their cognitive processes are slowed and scattered, impairing major aspects of daily life. Fatigue adds another layer. A huge number of individuals with depression report exhaustion. This isn't typical tiredness from staying up too late, though. It's a crushing, unrelenting fatigue that persists even after long stretches of sleep. Someone can spend 10 hours in bed and still wake up feeling as if they've barely slept an hour. From the perspective of friends, family, or co-workers, this can easily be dismissed as laziness. But sleep studies attached to depression research suggest something far different. Neurochemical cycles regulating energy are out of sync, and rest doesn't provide the relief it normally should. Again, it doesn't look like the stereotype of someone with visible sorrow, but it is depression nonetheless. Clinicians point out that people often don't walk into an appointment saying, "I feel hopeless." Instead, they say things like, "I can't focus at work," or "I'm always irritable with my family and don't know why." That difference in language is critical. If over 60% of those facing depression describe their struggles this way, rather than in terms of traditional sadness, it helps explain why depression is still so widely misunderstood, even in 2025. There's also the way depression manifests in physical forms, sometimes causing people to seek help in medical clinics rather than through a psychiatrist. Headaches, digestive issues, muscle tension, and chronic pain appear often in records of depressive disorders. If someone arrives complaining only of back pain or neck stiffness, it may take time before physicians connect those symptoms to underlying depression instead of treating them purely as physical problems. That gap of recognition explains why data shows many patients cycle through multiple appointments before mental health even enters the conversation. What becomes striking in this newer data is that depression is revealed more as a cluster of interconnected processes rather than a singular emotion. Sadness is one possibility, certainly, but not the defining one. This is why the stereotype painted in films, that blank stare into space, is now seen as misleading. In reality, many people aren't falling apart in tears, but are frustrated, mentally foggy, and physically worn down. Imagine how disorienting it would feel to wrestle with those effects and still think, "But I don't feel like I'm crying all the time, so this can't be depression, right?" That misunderstanding can prevent people from identifying their own experiences for what they are. The 2025 findings highlight again how essential it is not to tie a disorder too tightly to one visible marker. Mental health disorders are complex, and mental health professionals stress that oversimplification leads to underdiagnosis. If someone assumes depression equals visible sadness, then when irritability takes center stage in their daily life, they won't label it as depression and may not seek support in time. The result is that they continue to function under a heavy burden, unaware it's even treatable. Another important detail that emerges is how these atypical symptoms influence relationships. Irritability, for example, strains family dynamics and friendships when others don't know it's depression at work. A parent snapping at children, a co-worker losing composure during meetings, or a partner seeming constantly frustrated. Those scenarios can all sour relationships quickly. Without awareness, the response from others may be judgment or frustration, which only worsens isolation. The research pushes us to consider this ripple effect. Hidden symptoms of depression don't only harm the individual, but also reshape the social environment around them. Cognitive disruption has its own ripple effects. Forgetting appointments, struggling at school or work, or being indecisive in ordinary moments can erode confidence. People experiencing this often report greater self-doubt because they misinterpret their lapses as personal flaws instead of recognizing them as symptoms. Over time, this feeds into a cycle where the disorder deepens. The very act of struggling with concentration fuels the sense of worthlessness, which then intensifies the depression itself. That loop becomes harder to interrupt without understanding its root cause. Fatigue, too, can dismantle normal routines. Individuals struggling with this form of exhaustion frequently withdraw from activities, skip exercise, or stop social outings. This withdrawal not only removes their connection to energizing activities, but also denies them access to social support systems that could have offered relief. Again, the issue isn't simply feeling tired. It's that fatigue creates a cascade of changes that reshape behavior, often without the person realizing how deeply depression is embedded in it. All of these alternative presentations challenge the long-standing view of depression as easy to spot. If the majority don't walk into a clinic with complaints of sadness, then it means practitioners and the public both need to shift their lens. Education campaigns have traditionally emphasized mood as the hallmark. But as this research shows, the everyday manifestations, the snapping at a partner, the inability to get through an ordinary workday without mental fog, the exhaustion that defies sleep, may tell the real story in far more cases than people assume. This reframing has clinical implications too. For decades, diagnostic manuals debated whether irritability should even count for adult depression. It was typically acknowledged in children, but overlooked in adults. Now, with this broad survey data and the measurable prevalence of irritability and cognitive impairment, guidelines are being reconsidered. Clinicians are expanding their diagnostic perspectives, which could change how millions of people are assessed and treated going forward. That shift is gradual, but it represents an important recognition. When symptoms are invisible within the traditional narrative of depression, people suffer longer before receiving help. There's also a cultural aspect. In many parts of the world, emotions like sadness are stigmatized more heavily than irritability or physical complaints. This means individuals may be more comfortable reporting back pain or fatigue to a doctor rather than admitting to feelings of despair. When researchers looked across global samples in 2025, they observed how cultural influences shaped the symptoms people reported first. This echoed the point that depression hides behind what seems socially acceptable. Physical exhaustion can be talked about aloud. Grief or hopelessness often cannot. Think for a moment what that means on a personal level. Someone could live with depression for years without framing it as depression at all, because their experience does not mirror what they think depression should feel like. Instead, they've normalized constant tension, brain fog, and weariness, calling it stress or personality. By the time they encounter research that broadens this definition, the disorder may be deeply entrenched. This underscores the importance of spreading awareness, not just for academic purposes, but to help individuals recognize themselves in these patterns before it becomes overwhelming. So, as odd as it feels to say, depression doesn't always look sad. More often than not, it hides behind the irritability that strains a marriage, the cognitive lapses that sabotage productivity, or the exhaustion that turns ordinary life into an uphill climb. While statistics expose this, the lived reality is what carries weight. Countless people walking through daily life without realizing depression is shaping their every interaction. And that sets up an important question. If guilt often underlies these distortions, how exactly does that process go off track in the depressed brain? The unexpected role of guilt. Imagine this. You're on your way to work, you've packed your bag, everything seems in order, until you realize you forgot your phone charger at home. Most people would feel minor annoyance and move on. But for someone with depression, that tiny slip might trigger an avalanche of self-criticism. It's no longer just, I forgot my charger. It quickly becomes, I'm unreliable, I can't get basic things right, and I'm a failure at handling life. One small misstep transforms into a sweeping conclusion about their entire worth. And this overly harsh reaction helps illustrate how guilt plays a strange role in the disorder. Ordinarily, guilt functions as a healthy social and emotional regulator. It's the feeling that tells you to apologize if you snapped at someone unfairly, or to double-check that you didn't leave the stove on. In that sense, guilt is part of the machinery that keeps communities functioning. It keeps people aware when they've crossed a line or disappointed those they care about. Without it, we would lack an internal compass for correcting our mistakes. But depression twists this adaptive tool into something corrosive. Instead of flagging specific behaviors, guilt overactivates and applies itself to someone's entire identity. The result is not, I made an error, but rather, I am an error. That difference may sound subtle, but it changes the way a person sees themselves in every domain of life. This overgeneralized sense of guilt doesn't show up equally across situations. Research in 2025 used updated fMRI techniques to map what happens in the brain when people with depression process guilt-related scenarios. In healthy brains, the regions tied to recognizing guilt, primarily those linked to monitoring moral correctness, light up together, almost like a connected network that evaluates both the act and its context. In contrast, depressed brains show an unusual misfiring of this circuit. Specifically, the regions that should provide context, the reminders that forgetting a charger doesn't define who you are, fail to activate as strongly. What remains is the raw, unfiltered emotional weight of guilt without the balancing mechanism that puts it in perspective. This misfire explains why guilt in depression feels different from ordinary regret. For people without depression, guilt usually pushes a corrective action, like apologizing or fixing an oversight. Once that's done, the emotion subsides. But in depression, guilt lingers, repeating itself in a kind of background loop, disconnected from specific behaviors. Someone can keep feeling at fault even when there's no failure on their part, or when the mistake was too insignificant to warrant such an intense reaction. They begin to carry guilt not only for things they did, but also for events far outside their control. This overarching lens of self-blame doesn't just color their daily mood. It erodes self-esteem and sets up further symptoms, from indecision to withdrawal. Think of how this plays out in ordinary interactions. A person might cancel plans with a friend because of exhaustion, then feel guilty for letting them down. That guilt doesn't remain tied only to the cancelled plan. Instead, it spirals outward. I never keep commitments. I'm a bad friend. People are better off not dealing with me. Over time, this pattern builds an internal narrative where guilt ceases to be about discrete acts and becomes an identity statement. They aren't simply someone who cancelled plans. They internalize it as evidence they are broken. This illustrates how guilt, rather than encouraging moral responsibility, becomes a trap reinforcing hopelessness. In the updated neurological research, scientists highlight how this malfunctioning guilt system contributes to a cycle of chronic self-blame. The brain regions measured show reduced synchrony, something neuroscientists describe as underconnectivity between networks handling social evaluation and those handling personal responsibility. If the brain can't properly distinguish between I made a small mistake and I am a terrible person, then even neutral or ambiguous events can be interpreted as personal failings. For example, if a colleague doesn't reply to an email promptly, a depressed brain more readily turns that silence into evidence of being disliked or incompetent. This interpretation is not born from the external event itself, but from the distortion in the brain's guilt processing system. What makes these findings stand out is that they move beyond description into measurable biology. Past theories about guilt in depression were largely based on interviews and psychological observations. Now, imaging confirms patterns that many patients have articulated. Guilt feels disproportionate, inescapable, and untethered from context. The fMRI results show definite evidence that circuits involved in self-reflection aren't integrating information the way they normally would. Instead of weighing the full situation, the depressed brain zeroes in on the self as the cause of every problem. This difference helps explain why guilt plays such a central role in depression compared to other disorders. Anxiety, for example, tends to magnify fear of future events or catastrophes. Depression keys in on self-blame for past or current situations, even when those are trivial or imagined. The neurological data supports this distinction, showing sharper misalignment in guilt-related processing for people with depressive symptoms relative to those with primary anxiety. Although the two often appear together, guilt's persistence seems more uniquely anchored to depression, marking it as a critical factor in diagnosis and treatment. You can imagine how exhausting life becomes under this weight. If every forgotten chore, every late email, every distracted glance from a stranger registers as personal evidence of failure, mental and emotional energy soon deplete. This isn't simple pessimism. This is the brain trapping someone in patterns of self-condemnation by misfiring its evaluative systems. The misplaced guilt becomes not only a symptom, but also a driver of further impairment. Individuals may underestimate their capabilities, avoid opportunities, or withdraw from social circles to reduce the chances of failing again, even when no real failure has occurred. In clinical interviews, patients often describe feeling guilty for everything. That phrase captures the breadth of the distortion. Guilt spreads far beyond specific actions into a general sense of being fundamentally wrong. It's not that the person believes they occasionally let others down. They believe they are inherently disappointing. This kind of globalized guilt is difficult to challenge through logic alone because it arises from structural differences in brain function, not from a rational evaluation of events. Simply telling someone, "Don't be so hard on yourself," rarely helps, because their guilt isn't under straightforward voluntary control. For therapists and researchers, the 2025 findings highlight the importance of addressing guilt directly in treatment. Cognitive behavioral therapy often uses restructuring techniques to separate behaviors from self-worth. By guiding patients to identify the difference between "I made a mistake" and "I am the mistake," therapists try to introduce the missing contextual layer their neurological processing isn't providing naturally. Similarly, mindfulness approaches encourage individuals to observe guilt sensations without judgment, easing the tendency for guilt to become a full identity statement. These methods attempt to substitute, through conscious practice, the contextual grounding the depressed brain lacks spontaneously. Another dimension worth noting is how guilt connects to related symptoms like indecisiveness and rumination. If guilt is constantly overapplied, every choice feels loaded with the risk of failure, increasing hesitation. At the same time, unresolved guilt loops fuel repetitive thought cycles, where the brain keeps revisiting what went wrong in hopes of relief, but never finds resolution. The cumulative effect is a mental environment where moving forward feels impossible, and the person becomes ensnared in cycles of reflection that only deepen their depression. So guilt is not simply one symptom among many. It actively feeds into the mechanisms of other symptoms, magnifying the disorder's overall burden. Researchers speculate that changes in neurotransmission may underlie why these networks falter. Early analyses point to disruptions in serotonin and dopamine balance within the circuits involved in error monitoring and self-referential processing. While the details remain under investigation, these chemical imbalances may impair the coordination needed to contextualize guilt appropriately. Instead of signaling mild discomfort and encouraging better choices, the neurotransmitter disruption exaggerates the emotional side while minimizing the moderating perspective. Once again, it's important to notice how biological changes create subjective emotional experiences in very direct ways. From a treatment innovation standpoint, the discovery of distinct neural markers for guilt-related misprocessing raises hope for better diagnostics. Currently, most diagnoses rely on self-reports, which can miss subtle variations in symptom expression. A future where imaging could verify whether someone's guilt circuits misfire might help distinguish depression from other overlapping conditions. In fact, clinical teams in 2025 are already running pilot tests on whether these biomarkers can predict treatment response, since those with higher levels of maladaptive guilt processing may benefit more from therapies explicitly targeting self-blame. Guilt, then, stands as one of depression's most insidious forces. It transforms the ordinary mistakes of daily life into overarching evidence of inadequacy. It drains confidence, strains relationships, and feeds into the very cycles that perpetuate the illness. What might look to an outsider like unnecessary self-criticism or low self-esteem is, at a neurological level, a measurable disturbance in the way the brain integrates moral evaluation with self-perception. In essence, the brain's compass is faulty, pointing inward with excessive severity and refusing to turn outward toward a balanced view. All of this underlines why understanding guilt's role matters for both science and everyday support. Without recognition, it's easy to dismiss someone's self-blame as an exaggeration, not realizing their brain is misfiring in a way that locks them into that perception. By seeing guilt for what it is, a symptom shaped by neurological miscalibration rather than a true reflection of worth, it becomes possible to treat it as part of the disorder instead of as an accurate personal judgment. And that realization opens the door to asking a deeper question. If depression skews guilt so forcefully toward the self, why is it so rarely directed at others? Why self-blame turns into a trap? Why is it that people with depression tend to aim blame at themselves, but almost never direct it outward? It's a strange imbalance when you stop to think about it. If something goes wrong in a group effort, say the project at work falls behind, most people naturally spread responsibility across the circumstances, maybe some to themselves, maybe some to others. But in depression, that distribution narrows to one direction, inward. Even when the evidence points to multiple factors, the depressed individual feels as though they are the weak link holding everything back. This selective targeting of blame is not just an attitude problem. Research from psychology shows it follows a pattern that sets depression apart. What social psychology has demonstrated is that people carrying depressive symptoms process social failure differently. Instead of considering external events, they internalize bad outcomes and claim responsibility for them personally. The effect is so consistent that researchers have pointed out how depressed individuals rarely explain setbacks with the usual list of situational causes. Instead, their reasoning loops back to deficiencies in their character, whether or not they played much of a role at all. This process is not only inaccurate but deeply unfair, yet it persists because it builds upon the altered information flow we already saw in guilt-related brain activity. So why does the blame almost never travel outward? Part of the answer seems to come from the way human beings evolved to maintain close social ties. When something goes wrong between people, preserving the bond often requires someone to hold responsibility. In balanced mental states, that responsibility is negotiated. It may shift back and forth. But in depression, the brain seems to recalibrate that negotiation to keep social bonds intact at all costs, even at the expense of accurate self-assessment. By taking on all the blame, the depressed individual lowers the risk of conflict with others. From their brain's perspective, alienating a friend or family member could be worse than unfairly condemning themselves. The most recent theories from 2025 describe this as a distorted coping response. Instead of protecting the individual, the brain is stuck prioritizing the maintenance of social harmony. Although that may sound selfless on the surface, it comes at tremendous cost. Internalizing blame feeds the sense of being defective, while simultaneously teaching the brain to expect rejection if it tries to assign responsibility outward. Over time, this conditioning leads to cycles where the individual stops even considering the role of others, no matter how clear it might be. The brain convinces itself that keeping bonds safe means becoming the permanent target of blame. Let's think about how that plays out in everyday life. Imagine a conversation between two close friends where one forgets to show up to a planned dinner. In typical interactions, the absent friend apologizes, and both parties recognize the mistake as situational. But for someone with depression, the one left waiting might conclude, "I must not be entertaining enough," or "It's my fault for not reminding them." Even though the outside observer recognizes that the other person clearly failed to follow through, the depressed brain funnels all responsibility inward, rewriting reality in a way that harms the individual's own standing. Over months and years, this misallocation of blame undermines confidence. Each interaction becomes more threatening because the person anticipates they'll always be the one at fault. At work, This can show up in group assignments where someone apologizes endlessly for delays that came from scheduling issues beyond their control. In families, it can surface as one person silently absorbing conflict, convinced they are the core of every problem. The pressure of carrying constant responsibility affects decision-making, willingness to speak up, and long-term ability to trust oneself. What's fascinating about the updated 2025 theory is that it reframes this habit as not just random negativity, but as a socially driven adaptation gone awry. Human beings rely heavily on group belonging, and exclusion historically posed major survival risks. In that framework, always taking the blame might feel safer than standing up to others, because it preserves the group connection. From an evolutionary perspective, accepting blame can look like a defensive strategy to avoid conflict. But because the depressed brain exaggerates that process, it produces self-destructive patterns that carry far more damage than protection. Scientists point out that this theory helps explain why depression isolates people even when their drive is to stay bonded. By internalizing so much fault, individuals feel they are a burden. They then withdraw not from lack of care for others, but from a mistaken belief that their presence harms relationships. The irony is sharp. The very system designed to keep bonds strong ultimately pushes people away. It's not social laziness. It is the result of a protective mechanism working on distorted settings. The trap becomes deeper when guilt and blame combine. Once small mistakes transform into sweeping identity flaws, self-blame naturally intensifies. Forgetting a minor errand doesn't feel like a slip of memory, but solid evidence of failing as a parent, partner, or co-worker. That harsh judgment discourages sharing experiences with others. If someone already believes they are the entire problem, why speak out in hopes of balance? Silence then reinforces isolation, leaving fewer opportunities to test whether those harsh self-assessments hold up in reality. In that silence, the trap tightens. Neuroscientists comparing new imaging results with older behavioral theories suggest that selective self-blame may actually emerge from how the depressed brain misreads social signals. Instead of recognizing neutrality or shared responsibility, the brain interprets ambiguous cues, like a friend's delayed reaction, as critical feedback. Once those cues are misread, blame shifts inward instantly. It's a shortcut the brain takes, but instead of safeguarding connection, it strangles personal confidence. When amplified across repeated interactions, that shortcut becomes the automatic default. It's important to note how self-blame differs from healthy accountability. Everyone needs the capacity to reflect and take responsibility for their actions. Without it, relationships fracture. But in depression, that very strength oversaturates. Think of responsibility as a volume knob. Turned up too low, people deny their actions and damage bonds. Turned up too high, they consume failures, imagined or real, until their sense of self-worth erodes. Depression pushes that knob to maximum, and because it appears like humility from the outside, it often goes unnoticed. From the practical standpoint of treatment, recognizing this selective internalization opens pathways for intervention. Therapists often work to help individuals reassign responsibility in more balanced ways, guiding them through realistic appraisals of situations. Instead of immediately concluding, "I caused this failure," the exercise becomes examining what role circumstances and other people played. That practice begins to challenge the distorted survival strategy by teaching the brain that sharing responsibility does not lead to abandonment. Over time, these small reassignments rebuild trust both in oneself and in the stability of social bonds. Interestingly, the data also points to self-blame being context-dependent. Depressed individuals often show stronger internalization when failures involve people they care about rather than strangers. That pattern supports the idea that the drive to preserve important relationships is at the center of the distortion. The closer the bond, the greater the willingness to accept all blame. This selective focus confirms that the underlying mechanism ties back to social survival strategies. Understanding that helps healthcare workers target interventions where they matter most, in contexts where relationships carry weight and the distortion is strongest. Self-blame therefore functions as more than an emotion. It shapes perception, guides interaction, and locks individuals into repetitive cycles of guilt and withdrawal. The very act of embracing more responsibility than is deserved sets depression apart from ordinary sadness, because it warps how reality is interpreted day after day. This warped filter ensures that the story told inside the mind rarely matches what observers see outside. A group issue becomes my failure, An accident becomes my incompetence. A misunderstanding becomes my character flaw. The cost of this distortion is a constant erosion of mental resilience. Seen through the updated lens of 2025 research, the pattern almost appears strategic, though flawed. By sacrificing themselves as the designated source of blame, individuals hope, at least subconsciously, to shield their relationships. Yet that strategy backfires, because the accumulation of false responsibility leads them to believe others would be better off without them. The very bonds they wanted to protect become strained or broken under the weight of this pattern. It is strategy turned against itself, leaving the person not more connected, but more alone. This explains why selective self-blame is now considered central to depression's psychological profile. The disorder bends the natural desire for connection into a harmful loop, driving individuals to absorb more than is fair and leaving them drained from carrying responsibility that doesn't belong to them. It's a trap, hidden behind the appearance of taking ownership, but one that steadily dismantles the individual's ability to see events clearly. And once that trap takes hold, it opens the door to another process that deepens the cycle. Even further, the repetitive churn of rumination, where thoughts circle endlessly with no resolution in sight. Rumination, the mental hamster wheel. Rumination often feels like being trapped inside a mental browser where the same tab keeps reloading, but never actually closes. Imagine you've got 20 tabs open, each one playing background audio. None of them shut down, and no matter how many times you try to refresh or click away, the noise keeps going. That's what rumination does inside the brain during depression. It grabs onto one event, one feeling, or one worry, and replays it so constantly that the mind becomes clogged. At first glance, it might feel like genuine problem solving. After all, the brain is focusing hard on the issue, rehearsing what went wrong and searching for answers. But the key difference is that no solutions ever appear, just repetition without end. What makes rumination so tricky is that it sneaks in disguised as productive thought. Let's say you had an awkward conversation with a coworker. A healthy brain might pause afterward, reflect briefly, and decide either to apologize or let it go. Rumination takes that same situation and spins it on repeat. Why did I say that? What does she think about me? Did I ruin my reputation? Should I text her to explain? But what if she thinks I'm overreacting? I shouldn't have spoken at all. Instead of moving to resolution, the thought process collapses into loops that circle endlessly. Each lap around the loop feels urgent, like closure is just one more spin away, but nothing progresses. The result is a drain on mental resources. Working memory, the system responsible for holding information in mind while using it, gets hijacked. The brain allocates attention to the ruminative loop, leaving fewer resources for other tasks. Everyday responsibilities start to slip, not because of laziness, but because so much bandwidth is already occupied. The tasks themselves may be simple, but memory falters when the central processor is overloaded. Depressed individuals often report forgetting appointments, losing their train of thought mid-sentence, or making careless errors they wouldn't normally make. This is the cost of a brain caught in perpetual background processing. Researchers studying this pattern in 2025 describe rumination as more than a habit. Brain imaging shows that particular circuits involved in self-referential thought light up persistently during rumination episodes. Rather than shutting down after a conclusion is reached, these regions keep engaging as though there's still unfinished business. In practical terms, the brain never labels the issue solved. This difference is important because it separates rumination from ordinary problem-solving. Normal reflection ends when the brain marks the task complete. Rumination is the malfunction of that off switch, causing constant recycling. This repetitive mode also explains why rumination feels mentally exhausting. To the outside observer, it looks like someone is just sitting quietly. Inside, however, attention systems are running at maximum speed, flicking back and forth across the same handful of thoughts. Picture a hamster wheel. Huge effort, endless movement, zero progress forward. That's how living with rumination feels. What makes it even harder is that people often believe if they think long enough, the answer will finally emerge. This belief keeps them gripping onto the wheel, even when it drains their energy, without producing new insights. Over time, rumination sharpens the emotional charge of negative experiences. A small mistake at work that might otherwise fade quickly becomes cemented in memory, simply because it's revisited so often. Each replay enhances the emotional intensity, The way listening to the same sad song can deepen the mood instead of easing it. This is part of why depression worsens once rumination sets in. The cycle doesn't just keep sadness alive, it amplifies and extends it. What could have passed in a day might remain present for weeks because of constant mental rehearsal. Another striking finding is that rumination impairs decision-making. When working memory is occupied with repetitive content, cognitive flexibility, the skill required to explore different options, shrinks. The brain cannot scan a wide field of alternatives while also looping over old mistakes. Simple choices, like what to cook for dinner, feel overwhelming because cognitive space is already consumed. People often describe feeling stuck in indecision, which is a direct expression of rumination's toll. Decisions that should be trivial stretch out endlessly, adding to stress levels and reinforcing feelings of incompetence. In clinical practice, rumination often announces itself as a complaint about overthinking. Clients say they lie awake at night, replaying the same conversation or mistake. They recognize it doesn't help, yet can't seem to stop. This is an important detail. Awareness of the loop doesn't automatically produce control over it. Knowing you are running inside a hamster doesn't let you simply step off when the machinery is being powered by neurological circuits beyond conscious regulation. That sense of being trapped increases frustration, which then feeds more rumination. Why can't I just let this go? What's wrong with me that I keep replaying this? The loop doubles back and multiplies. There's also a social dimension to rumination. Because depressed individuals often internalize blame, as we saw earlier, they tend to focus their loops on self-criticism. This means the majority of ruminative content is self-directed, not outwardly aggressive. Instead of thinking about how others were unfair, the mind spins on what the individual did wrong, whether they appeared foolish, or how badly they handled a situation. This personal focus of rumination intensifies guilt and shame, cementing them into core parts of identity. The brain doesn't just recall the error, it keeps stamping it into memory until it becomes indistinguishable from character. Rumination is one of the strongest bridges between depression and anxiety. While depression's loops focus on what already went wrong, anxiety's loops focus on what could go wrong. Both rely on the same neural networks that circle and repeat thought without closure. This shared mechanism is one reason the two conditions often appear together. For the depressed brain, what loops is regret. For the anxious brain, it's worry about the future. But both rely on the same machinery of repetitive thinking that depletes working memory and decision-making capacity. Evidence from 2025 expands on earlier findings by quantifying just how much rumination impairs core functions. Laboratory tests asking participants to hold strings of numbers while performing tasks revealed that individuals prone to rumination performed significantly worse. Their working memory had less available space, even when they weren't actively recalling a negative event at that moment. This suggests rumination rewires the brain into a chronic state of reduced capacity, not simply momentary distraction. Even when the loop isn't clearly running, it leaves the processor slowed, almost as if background tabs remain open invisibly. The data also underline rumination's role in prolonging depression episodes. People who engage in higher levels of repetitive negative thought recover more slowly, even when receiving treatment. The habit entrenches depressive patterns by reinforcing cognitive distortions and preventing opportunities for positive reinforcement. In other words, while medication or therapy may begin altering mood pathways, rumination keeps refreshing the very errors the brain is trying to correct. As a result, treatment must target rumination explicitly rather than assuming it will fade as mood improves. From a psychological standpoint, rumination functions almost like a mental reflex. The brain detects distress and responds by re-examining the issue, in the way one might re-examine a puzzle that hasn't been solved. But unlike a jigsaw puzzle on the table, rumination lacks boundaries. There is no completed state that signals you're done. This endless search without end state consumes focus indefinitely, which not only explains the subjective fatigue, but also shows why breaking the cycle requires structural intervention, redirecting attention deliberately rather than waiting for the loop to end on its own. This finding shifts how depression is understood in practice. Instead of framing it solely as a mood disorder, clinicians increasingly describe it as a disorder of attention. The brain's focus locks onto negative loops, disregarding context and resolution. By reframing depression this way, researchers hope to highlight the importance of retraining attention, not just lifting mood chemically. Cognitive therapies that teach interruption techniques, such as deliberately shifting focus onto sensory details or concrete tasks, are designed to pull attention back from the wheel. The success of these techniques supports the idea that depression's grip lies not only in sadness, but in the mechanics of where attention gets stuck. Patients often describe relief when they finally see rumination as something automatic rather than something they are choosing to do. Without that perspective, the cycle feels like a personal flaw. Why am I obsessed with this small detail? Understanding that the loop is brain-driven helps separate identity from symptom. It reintroduces the possibility of change, since external tools can interrupt automatic processes. Awareness without self-blame becomes a crucial first step to breaking the cycle. Rumination also helps explain why depression damages memory. When working memory is perpetually taxed, it can't encode new information efficiently. This is why people often forget conversations or tasks while depressed. The brain's active capacity is consumed. It's not that they don't care or don't pay attention. It's that rumination's occupation of resources leaves inadequate room for ordinary memory processes. This insight has reshaped how researchers interpret so-called cognitive deficits in depression. They are not signs of intellectual decline, but the predictable outcome of rumination bogging down resources. In this light, rumination emerges not as a side effect, but as a central engine of depression's cognitive disruption. Its recursive loops sustain guilt, sharpen self-blame, exhaust attention, weaken decision-making, and undermine memory. The hamster wheel is more than a metaphor. It's an accurate picture of mental engines running endlessly without direction. And this endless internal motion, invisible from the outside, explains why people struggling may look still on the surface, yet feel completely drained inside. It's the hidden labor of a brain trapped in loops, and it sets the stage for the next symptom that often baffles both patients and clinicians: the startling memory problems that follow directly from this constant overoccupation of thought. Memory problems that nobody expects. Shouldn't memory and mood be totally separate? At first glance, they seem like two different departments in the mind. Memory is about facts, events, and tasks, while mood is about feelings. But the data from recent research in 2025 paints a more complicated picture, one where emotional states and thought processes overlap in ways that can surprise people. Depression, long thought of mainly as an emotional disorder, appears to have direct effects on memory. And not just in abstract or minor ways, but in real lapses of daily functioning that can alter how people live their lives. Depressed individuals often report a foggy sense of focus, but the evidence goes beyond anecdotes. Memory difficulties extend into two distinct domains: episodic memory and working memory. Episodic memory is the ability to recall events and experiences, like a conversation with a friend or where one parked a car. Working memory is the ability to hold small bits of information in mind while actively using them, like remembering a phone code while entering it into a keypad. In 2025 experiments, both types of memory were tested in individuals with depression, and the findings showed measurable differences compared to those without the condition. These differences highlight that mood and memory are intertwined because attention and cognition draw from finite mental resources, and depression drains those resources through its repetitive processes. Rumination plays a central role in this drain. When someone is locked into cycles of repetitive negative thinking, their mental bandwidth is partially occupied at all times. This leaves less focus available for encoding new material into memory. For example, a person could be listening to work instructions, but simultaneously replaying a personal misstep from the previous evening. Because part of their focus is stuck on that loop, the brain fails to solidify the new information. Later, when asked what the instructions were, the person genuinely cannot recall them. To outsiders, it looks like carelessness or inattention. In reality, the memory system never encoded the information in the first place because ruminative loops monopolize the bandwidth. These findings line up with examples from day-to-day life. People with depression often talk about walking into a room and forgetting what they came for, or reading the same paragraph several times without absorbing it. While everyone occasionally experiences these lapses, they occur with striking frequency in depressed populations. The 2025 studies reinforce this observation, showing that when participants were asked to hold a sequence of digits or short phrases in working memory, those with higher rumination scores struggled more to recall them, even just moments later. The task wasn't inherently challenging, but their mental machinery was already busy running background loops. What's striking about these results is how they alter the perception of memory issues in depression. For a long time, forgetfulness was dismissed as secondary, something people experienced because they were tired, demotivated, or distracted. But these studies suggest a direct cognitive limitation. In effect, rumination doesn't just overlay sadness. It occupies the very neural circuits responsible for stabilizing and retrieving memory. Negative thought cycles function like unauthorized programs running in the background of a computer, slowing down every other application. No matter how powerful the computer is, if endless tasks are chewing up resources, performance lags. Depression places memory on those same terms. Constant mental processes, reducing available bandwidth. Another important detail is how this problem presents inconsistently. People with depression may perform well on tasks that don't compete with active rumination. If attention is fully available, memory can function near normally. But during or after cycles of rumination, when resources are tied up, lapses become common. This inconsistency frustrates both patients and providers because memory issues can seem unpredictable. One day, tasks are completed well. Another day, the same tasks fall apart. This variance often deepens self-criticism. People interpret slip-ups as signs of laziness or incompetence rather than recognizing that their cognitive system was overloaded. This misunderstanding feeds into the guilt and self-blame system we've already discussed. The divide between episodic and working memory also offers insight. Episodic lapses show up when past events blend together, leaving people uncertain whether something happened yesterday, last week, or not at all. Working memory lapses show up in immediate contexts, forgetting why one opened an app, or losing track of a sentence midway through speaking it. Either type can disrupt daily functioning, but they differ in their impact. Episodic loss creates larger uncertainties about personal history, while working memory failures undermine moment-to-moment efficiency. Together, they form a profile that challenges the idea of depression as purely a disorder of mood. Instead, depression now looks like a condition that reshapes the fundamentals of human cognition. This adds context to complaints of brain fog. People often use that phrase loosely, but the data shows there are actual cognitive deficits embedded in the depressive state. Tasks requiring sustained attention or complex juggling of details naturally fall apart when memory systems are taxed. Unexpectedly, even routine tasks, like taking medications on time or following through on appointments, become vulnerable. It's not unusual for patients to miss doses, misplace bills, or forget deadlines, and yet still retain sharpness in fields unaffected by rumination. The disconnect adds to confusion, because intelligent individuals can find themselves failing basic tasks. Without awareness of depression's effects, they may interpret those failures as proof of deteriorating intelligence or willpower. Biologically, researchers in 2025 identified changes in how attention control networks interact with memory circuits under depressive strain. Scans showed reduced efficiency in regions that are supposed to suppress distraction. Instead of filtering out intrusive negative thoughts, the brain leaves the door open, allowing ruminations to interfere directly with encoding and recollection. This lends a structural explanation for the subjective experience of being unable to focus no matter how hard one tries. It's not laziness, it's a system failing to block irrelevant content from consuming resources. The everyday implications are notable. For someone living with depression, even simple tasks, shopping, answering emails, or replying to texts, can become tests of memory. They may open a message intending to respond, but get sidetracked by a negative thought loop, leaving the reply unsent. Days later, they realize they never responded. Such incidents accumulate, giving the impression of neglect to friends or colleagues. In truth, it wasn't neglect, but a momentary occupation of working memory. Multiply this across dozens of small tasks, and the effects can easily spiral into disruptions at work, strain in relationships, and a growing sense of incompetence that reinforces depressive self-criticism. These memory lapses are particularly damaging because society often misreads them. Forgetting an appointment is seen as irresponsible. Forgetting an instruction at work is seen as careless. Forgetting to pay attention during a conversation is seen as disinterest. When these judgments occur, they unknowingly mirror the person's own inner self-blame, deepening the psychological load. Without awareness that depression alters working memory mechanically, both the individual and those around them mistake symptoms for character flaws. That misinterpretation delays help and fuels stigma. The research also showed that memory failures were more pronounced in situations where emotional content was involved. Neutral tasks, like recalling random word lists, were sometimes less impaired than recalling details about interpersonal events. This suggests that negative thought loops specifically invade memories tied to social and emotional scenarios. As a result, people may clearly recall neutral stimuli, but lose track of who said what in a meaningful conversation. This again emphasizes the selective interaction between mood and memory. The areas where self-perception is most fragile are exactly where memory becomes least reliable. Therapists and clinicians point out that treating memory issues in depression requires different strategies than in typical memory decline. When depression lifts, many memory functions improve rapidly, showing that the deficits were not permanent loss but temporary cognitive overload. This is important because it reassures patients who worry their brains are permanently damaged. In fact, memory often returns to baseline when depression is addressed. Practical strategies in therapy, like breaking tasks down into explicit reminders, externalizing memory onto checklists, or reducing multitasking, can reduce the burden while rumination remains active. These tools compensate for impaired working memory by reducing reliance on limited capacity systems. Another dimension is how memory impairment can shape identity. When someone repeatedly forgets simple things, they may conclude that they are unreliable by nature. Combined with the pre-existing guilt and self-blame, this forms part of the depressive identity. I'm the one who always forgets. Rather than seeing it as a symptom, individuals weave it into their self-concept. Over time, this erodes confidence further. The recognition that forgetfulness is mechanical, not moral, becomes a crucial distinction for both patients and caregivers. It's worth noting that memory problems don't just inconvenience life, they actively make recovery harder. If therapy depends on remembering coping tools or following structured exercises, impaired memory can reduce treatment success. Patients may forget to practice a skill or keep a log, not because of lack of effort, but because depressive memory dysfunction disrupts follow-through. This feedback loop complicates treatment, meaning therapists must adapt plans to the patient's current cognitive capacity. Recognizing memory impairment as part of the clinical picture can make therapy more compassionate and more effective. In sum, the idea that mood and memory occupy separate corners of the brain doesn't hold up under recent research. Depression saturates cognition in ways that directly shape how memory functions. The core issue isn't lack of intelligence or willingness, but a constant drain on attention caused by repetitive thought loops. That drain prevents encoding of new information and retrieval of recent experiences. As studies in 2025 emphasize, the memory issues are not quirks or signs of laziness. They reflect how cognitive systems buckle under persistent negative cycles. These findings add weight to the view of depression as a broad cognitive disorder rather than only an emotional one. And these broad effects help explain why other symptoms, like irritability, emerge just as strongly. Because when thinking capacities run on reduced bandwidth, emotional regulation wears thin and frustration rises toward those closest at hand. Irritability, the hidden mask of depression. Why does depression sometimes show up not as tears, but as snapping at the people closest to you? This question has puzzled both patients and clinicians for decades. When we imagine depression, the mind easily conjures images of withdrawal, sadness, silence, or tearful exhaustion. But the lived reality is that a large number of people experience it in a completely different form. Bursts of irritability, quick tempers, and a shortened fuse. Friends and family often see the anger, but not the sadness, which makes the underlying condition harder to recognize. Rather than expressing grief or despair outwardly, the depression filters through as impatience and conflict, leaving relationships under strain while symptoms remain hidden. For many years, psychiatry considered irritability more of a child or adolescent sign of depression. Diagnostic manuals used by clinicians described it in youth, but excluded it as a formal adult feature. Adults were assumed to show depression primarily through sadness, loss of interest, or hopelessness. If irritability appeared, it was often interpreted as a separate issue or linked to stress, personality, or even poor coping skills. This exclusion meant generations of adults living with depression weren't recognized if their symptoms registered more as anger than as despair. They were told they had anger problems, when in many cases, the irritability was a mask over an internal depressive state. What the data from 2025 illustrate clearly is that this mask is not only common, but also deeply revealing. More than half of adults with depression report experiencing anger outbursts. This isn't casual annoyance or the occasional bad mood. It involves strong surges of frustration, quick escalation in arguments, and emotional intensity that feels disproportionate to the trigger. A late text from a friend might spiral into accusations. A small request at work might invoke harsh frustration. These patterns strain relationships and often reinforce the depressed individual's sense of being out of control or burdensome, which in turn increases self-blame. Instead of relief, the anger cycle feeds directly back into the illness. Researchers have begun to parse why irritability emerges in depression. One theory highlights the cognitive load of rumination and guilt. When the brain is overloaded with repetitive negative thoughts, mental bandwidth shrinks. In these moments, self-control, already weakened, has little capacity to modulate frustration. Small irritants, which normally would be brushed off, carry an exaggerated weight. The emotion regulation system is stretched thin, and anger bursts through where patience would normally hold. So irritability in depression is not random. It reflects the accumulation of depleted cognitive resources, combined with heightened sensitivity to perceived rejection or failure. Brain imaging adds another layer. Studies show that the neural circuits controlling emotional regulation, particularly those involving the anterior cingulate cortex and prefrontal regions, operate differently during depressive episodes. These areas usually help evaluate context and apply restraint when frustration arises. But under depression, connectivity between these structures weakens. Signals that would normally say, "This irritation is small, you can let it go," don't transmit as effectively. Instead, the amygdala, which drives quick emotional responses like anger, becomes more reactive. This imbalance explains why irritability appears so often. The restraint system falters as the reaction system gets louder. An important point in the recent findings is that irritability doesn't just accompany depression. It may actually mark its more severe forms. The presence of anger outbursts correlates with greater impairment, longer episode durations, and higher likelihood of relapse. Clinicians now consider severe irritability not as a side symptom, but as a signal that the illness may be more entrenched. Recognizing irritability as a sign of severity changes how depression is assessed. A patient reporting no sadness, but frequent arguments may be showing a red flag that previously was missed. From the perspective of day-to-day life, irritability creates a distinct pattern. At home, it can mean parents yelling at children for minor behaviors, or partners clashing over trivial issues. At work, it might look like harsh comments in meetings or abrupt reactions to feedback. These expressions often lead to guilt afterward. The depressed individual knows their reaction felt excessive, reinforcing the sense of being flawed, which deepens hopelessness. The cycle repeats. Irritability erupts, guilt sinks in afterward, and self-blame accumulates. The link between irritability and guilt becomes self-sustaining, making symptoms worse rather than resolving them. Cultural factors also shape how irritability is read. In some societies, sadness is stigmatized more directly than anger. A man expressing tearfulness may be judged harshly, while irritability can be written off as stress. This cultural bias hides depression further, because the symptom appearing most visibly, anger, is misinterpreted as ordinary frustration. For individuals, this misreading delays treatment. They may spend years believing they simply have a bad temper, rather than a mood disorder. As the data shows, this distinction matters because untreated irritability-driven depression carries high risks for relationship breakdown and long-term isolation. The 2025 findings also challenged the long-standing belief that irritability is rarer in adults. Surveys across diverse populations revealed consistent patterns. Anger isn't peripheral, it's central for many. Half or more of respondents who met criteria for depression reported irritability as a main feature. This prevalence rate argues strongly for updating diagnostic frameworks. If the goal of diagnosis is to capture how conditions manifest in real lives, then irritation and anger bursts deserve recognition alongside sadness, hopelessness, and apathy as defining features. Ignoring them risks underdiagnosis and mislabeling of millions of people worldwide. There's also the ripple effect. Depression's irritability doesn't only impact the person experiencing it. It reverberates through families, workplaces, and friendships. Children living with irritable parents absorb the brunt of it, sometimes mistaking the tension for rejection. Spouses report feeling confused by the suddenness of anger, unsure if their partner's outburst reflects dissatisfaction with them or something deeper. In workplaces, colleagues may brand depressed individuals as difficult personalities. These secondary consequences add layers of stress and misunderstanding that entrench depression further. Recognizing irritability as a symptom broadens empathy, reframing outbursts not as pure hostility, but as part of a treatable mental state. Another striking insight from the new research is the connection between irritability and treatment outcomes. Patients with prominent irritability often respond differently to medication, sometimes requiring combinations that target both mood and emotional reactivity. This creates an important clinical reminder. Not all depression looks the same, and treatment plans should account for irritability as a significant factor. Psychotherapies focused on emotional regulation, such as dialectical behavior therapy techniques, are being adapted to address depressive irritability specifically, providing patients with concrete tools to manage outbursts before they erupt. From a psychological perspective, it helps to understand irritability as frustration turned outward. Where guilt turns negativity against oneself, irritability aims it at others. Yet, underneath, both come from the same system: the inability to regulate stress and cognitive overload. Once seen this way, irritability becomes less confusing. Rather than interpreting it as pure aggression, people can understand it as frustration rooted in depleted control circuits. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it does give it context. And context is essential for building compassion and effective intervention. It's also worth noting how irritability can disguise depression from the sufferers themselves. Individuals conditioned to associate depression only with sadness often struggle to accept the label when they don't feel sad, but do feel angry. If their dominant symptom is irritability, they may feel misdiagnosed. This disconnect creates resistance to treatment. However, by broadening the public understanding of depression to include irritability, people may recognize themselves in the diagnosis sooner, increasing the chance they'll seek and stick with treatment. Finally, the recognition of irritability as a defining marker challenges our simple cultural narratives. Depression is not just about retreating inward in tears. It can also surge outward in anger. This mask confuses families, undermines relationships, and delays help. But with emerging evidence, the message is clearer. More than half of adults with depression experience anger outbursts, and those expressions often mark the illness as more severe. Clinicians, families, and individuals must keep this picture in mind, because identifying irritability as depression's hidden mask allows earlier recognition and more targeted support. And when irritability drains patience and leaves tempers fragile, it can also set the stage for another symptom that makes depression feel even more inescapable: the heavy fatigue that no amount of rest seems to resolve. Fatigue that medicine can't explain. Think about this for a minute. You go to bed early, sleep a full 10 hours, and still crawl out of bed feeling as if you never slept at all. No matter how much rest you get, the exhaustion lingers, pressing down on your body like a weight you can't shake off. For many people with depression, this is one of the most frustrating and confusing symptoms. And when they finally bring it up at a doctor's office, the next step is usually a round of blood tests or scans. Yet, those results often come back with nothing unusual. Thyroid levels, blood counts, vitamin levels, all normal. That mismatch between feeling completely drained and looking medically fine, on paper has given this symptom a reputation as fatigue without cause. But the underlying picture is very different. Depression is not simply draining motivation. It is changing energy regulation at a biological level. What researchers now understand is that depression disrupts neurochemical cycles of energy in ways that ordinary rest cannot repair. Falling asleep and staying asleep is not always the problem. The problem is what the brain and body are doing, or failing to do, while you sleep. Energy production in the brain depends on an intricate exchange of neurotransmitters and hormones. In depression, these cycles can fall out of sync, leaving people feeling perpetually tired despite sleeping longer than average. The outcome is an exhaustion that feels both physical and mental at the same time. It's not laziness, and it's not just low mood. It's the body struggling to maintain a basic rhythm of energy and rest. Studies in 2025 highlight one important mechanism. Depression often involves dysregulation in systems that control circadian rhythms, the body's internal clock. Ordinarily, this clock helps regulate when we feel awake and when we feel tired by orchestrating hormone release throughout the day. With depression, these timing systems falter. Instead of rising cortisol early in the morning to encourage alertness, levels may spike at inconsistent times or remain high throughout the night. Since cortisol interacts with other systems that control sleep quality, misalignment there means the restorative aspects of sleep never fully engage. Someone might technically sleep many hours, but wake up feeling unrefreshed because their body never cycled through the stages of rest in the proper pattern. That misalignment matters in everyday life. People waking from sleep without restoration describe mornings as uphill battles. It can take hours to feel alert, if that alertness comes at all. Even simple routines like getting out of bed, making breakfast, and preparing for the day can feel impossible. To outsiders, fatigue appears indistinguishable from lack of willpower. Yet the persistence and severity point to an energy management issue rooted in the brain. People with depression often say they want to be active, but can't summon the internal push to match. That mismatch between intention and capacity is one of the most demoralizing aspects of the condition. The relationship between fatigue and depression complicates diagnosis too. Patients often present fatigue as their primary complaint, especially when sadness or hopelessness are less dominant. They may see general practitioners before ever seeing a mental health provider. And when standard tests come back with no clear medical explanation, the patient can feel dismissed. "You're fine," the paperwork says, yet subjectively they remain worn down day after day. Without awareness that fatigue can be a sign of depression, both patients and doctors risk missing the link. This gap delays access to therapies that might realign those disrupted energy cycles. One factor contributing to fatigue in depression is inefficient neurotransmission in pathways governing dopamine and serotonin. These chemicals influence motivation and energy regulation. In healthy conditions, surges of dopamine encourage goal pursuit and physical activity. In depressive states, diminished signaling makes everyday tasks feel like monumental effort. It's not simply a belief that things are harder. It is the absence of neurochemical reinforcement that typically makes initiating and sustaining activity feel rewarding. Combined with persistent rumination that already drains working memory, energy levels fall further. The system stalls in both thought and action, creating immobility that is incorrectly perceived as apathy. Chronic fatigue in depression also influences physical responses to activity itself. For many patients, small bursts of effort lead to exaggerated depletion. Taking a short walk or completing ordinary chores may leave them feeling disproportionately drained afterward, far more than someone without depression performing the same activity. This suggests metabolic inefficiency. The body is burning through resources, but failing to replenish them in the expected way. Over time, this depleting cycle discourages activity altogether, not because of disinterest, but because the cost consistently outweighs the return. Once again, what looks like giving up is closer to avoiding pain. One of the most sobering findings from 2025 research is how strongly fatigue predicts functional impairment. Among patients studied, levels of fatigue were more closely correlated with inability to sustain employment than levels of sadness or hopelessness. That means exhaustion, not emotional pain alone, is what often triggers withdrawal from work or daily responsibilities. The data highlight fatigue as one of depression's most disabling features, stripping individuals of autonomy, not through simple sadness, but through depletion of energy. There's another side to why fatigue remains hidden in depression. Cultural narratives glamorize tiredness as the result of hard work. Always busy, always grinding. When someone is constantly exhausted, it's easy for them and others around them to assume it's just lifestyle catching up. The assumption that fatigue springs from stress, poor diet, or lack of exercise overlooks how depression itself warps the mechanics of energy regulation. Patients may spend months trying to fix themselves through lifestyle changes, and when fatigue persists, self-blame strengthens. The narrative becomes, "I should be able to improve this, and I can't." That narrative reinforces the illness. In real-world terms, fatigue forms part of the depressive downward spiral. Energy loss prevents activity. Inactivity reduces exposure to rewarding experiences, worsening mood. Lower mood reinforces fatigue by amplifying stress hormones and disrupting circadian rhythms further. The longer fatigue remains unaddressed, the more entrenched depression becomes. It's not a passing dip in energy, but a locked cycle supported by biological changes and reinforced by daily experience. These patterns help explain one of depression's cruel paradoxes. Sometimes the person most in need of help has the least energy to initiate it. Making appointments, engaging in exercise, or even explaining symptoms out loud requires a reserve of energy that depression diminishes. That's why fatigue is often one of the hardest symptoms for loved ones to understand. To someone looking in, it feels like avoidance. From the inside, it feels like the laws of motion themselves have shifted. Every action requires an energy reserve that is no longer available. To address fatigue clinically, some approaches focus on restoring rhythm. Bright light therapy targets circadian misalignment by presenting controlled light exposure in the morning. This encourages the brain's clock to reset, helping cortisol release return to its healthier pattern. Other interventions build structured activity into the day, not to eliminate fatigue instantly, but to gradually retrain body rhythms to expect energy expenditure and renewal. Paired with psychotherapy addressing rumination, which itself drains cognitive resources, these rhythm-based treatments can lighten the grip of fatigue over time. Another important insight is how fatigue interacts with sleep quality beyond duration. Depressed patients often experience disrupted REM cycles or spend more time in shallow sleep stages. Even though they may log excess sleep hours, those hours are not restorative in the way deep sleep is. So the problem is not just quantity of sleep but quality. This explains why advice like, just sleep more, rarely helps depression-related fatigue. Without addressing the disrupted regulation of sleep cycles, quantity alone cannot resolve the exhaustion. It's critical to recognize fatigue not as a vague symptom, but as a measurable and central feature of depression. Brain scans in 2025 suggest changes in energy metabolism are tangible, with reduced glucose utilization in certain brain regions associated with motivation and activity. That disruption helps tie subjective reports of fatigue to observed biological evidence. Knowing the fatigue has a detectable basis in the brain challenges stigma and supports a shift in recognizing it as part of the disorder rather than a lifestyle failing. Fatigue also sheds light on the link between depression and physical pain. When the body's systems for energy and rest falter, sensitivity thresholds drop. Tasks that require sustained posture or movement easily trigger pain responses. Patients often complain of muscle aches or joint discomfort, not explained by injury. These physical symptoms emerge because strained energy systems make ordinary exertion feel punishing. This is one reason why depression overlaps so frequently with chronic pain reports. Both conditions amplify each other through mismanaged signals of fatigue. Seeing fatigue as central, not peripheral, to depression changes how we think about the disorder as a whole. It reframes depression from being purely about sadness to being about systemic dysregulation of some of the most basic body processes. Fatigue is not optional. It is not a personal flaw. It is the body running with circuitry that no longer knows when to give energy or when to restore it. Understanding this hidden mechanism adds to the picture of depression as a multi-layered condition that extends across thought, feeling, and biology. Ultimately, when someone sleeps 10 hours and wakes up drained, the symptom is both real and measurable. It's not undetectable. It's simply not visible on routine blood panels. The patterns of energy regulation that lie beneath depression don't always leave obvious fingerprints in common medical tests. But newer studies show the disruption clearly. Fatigue is depression's weight no test can yet catch in a simple score, but it crushes functionality more than any other symptom. And understanding that opens the door to another puzzle. If fatigue can reshape how the body feels without physical injury, what's happening in the brain to make ordinary pain feel so much sharper during depression? Depression's strange relationship with pain. Why is it that patients with chronic back pain are significantly more likely to develop depression, even when their imaging results show no clear injury? This question has puzzled scientists for decades. On the surface, it seems logical to assume pain comes from tissue damage, a slipped disc, a muscle tear, a detectable injury. But in many cases, no structural explanation exists. The scans look normal, yet the pain is real and, in many cases, relentless. This paradox becomes even more interesting once you consider how closely pain and depression overlap. People with long-standing aches and discomfort are at higher risk of developing depressive symptoms, and those who already suffer from depression are more likely to report physical pain. The connection runs both ways. The tension here lies in the mismatch. If pain requires injury, why do so many people with depression experience persistent physical pain without identifiable cause? And why does depression heighten the risk of developing chronic pain after even minor injuries? The answer appears in the way depression modifies how pain signals are processed within the brain. not just in how tissues send signals upward. Rather than damage at the level of muscle or bone, the difference sits in pathways that decide how strongly those signals are felt once they arrive in the nervous system. Researchers have long studied the pain matrix, a collection of brain regions active when we experience discomfort. This includes areas that handle the raw sensory input, such as the intensity and location of pain, and areas that manage the emotional and attentional response. In depression, activity across these networks changes. The circuits amplifying emotional context become more active, while those that regulate or dampen responses show reduced effectiveness. The result is not imagined pain, it's heightened pain perception. Tissues may be intact, but the brain filters signals in a way that multiplies their intensity. Think of it like a poorly calibrated speaker system. The input signal is normal, but the amplifier is malfunctioning, making every sound much louder than it should be. In depression, ordinary signals from muscles or nerves become amplified, leaving the brain to interpret them as continuous pain. This explains why clinical settings often show patients describing significant discomfort, yet displaying no identifiable physical cause. Their brains are indeed processing pain, just through altered filters biased toward magnification. Recent work in 2025 helps clarify this. Neuroimaging revealed that patients with depression showed heightened activation in the anterior cingulate cortex and insula when exposed to mild pain stimuli compared to those without depression. These areas are not only involved in sensory discrimination, but also in evaluating the unpleasantness of pain. That distinction matters. Pain isn't just about detecting a signal, it's about how distressing the brain decides that signal is. Depression appears to prime these evaluative pathways to exaggerate distress, making discomfort feel more severe and more intrusive than the raw input alone would justify. Another layer comes from neurotransmitters. Serotonin and norepinephrine are crucial in regulating both mood and pain transmission. Depressed states often involve disruptions in these systems. Since both chemicals also help dampen pain signals in spinal pathways, their reduced availability means the body loses part of its natural pain filtering capacity. Instead of blocking or reducing mild discomfort, the nervous system lets more signals through, translating into stronger subjective pain experiences. Here again, the overlap between mood regulation and pain perception becomes clear. Changes in one domain inevitably spill into the other. This overlap is particularly visible when looking at comorbid conditions. Patients with depression are overrepresented among those experiencing fibromyalgia, chronic, widespread pain without visible tissue pathology. Historically, some dismissed these cases as psychosomatic, implying the pain wasn't real. Current findings strongly counter that idea. The pain is real, but its root isn't muscle damage. It lies in the altered way pain processing systems amplify incoming signals. Depression doesn't invent pain, it exaggerates it. This amplification builds a feedback loop. The more severe the pain, the greater the disruption to daily life. People withdraw from exercise, reduce activities, and sometimes leave work. That withdrawal feeds depression further by cutting off rewarding activities and strengthening isolation. At the same time, the worsening depression feeds the amplification loop, heightening pain perception. The cycle becomes self-sustaining. Pain worsens mood, and mood intensifies pain. Breaking it requires acknowledging both sides of the loop. Purely treating pain without addressing depression, or only addressing depression without strategies for pain management, leaves the system ready to restart. Practical examples show how easily this cycle manifests. Someone with a mild back twinge might, in a non-depressed state, recover after a few weeks of rest and gradual return to activity. In a depressed state, however, that same mild injury can spiral into months or even years of perceived pain. Each movement is interpreted through a heightened pain filter, convincing the individual to avoid activity. That inactivity weakens muscles, placing more strain on the back, which generates more discomfort. The subjective pain amplifies again, reinforcing both avoidance and depression. Over time, what began as a minor incident becomes a chronic condition, maintained not by persistent injury, but by altered brain processing combined with behavioral changes. Social factors also shape this relationship. Pain isolates because it reduces mobility and makes ordinary outings exhausting. Depression isolates by convincing individuals that they're burdensome or incapable. Together, they reinforce each other's social withdrawal patterns. Surveys show that individuals with both conditions are significantly more likely to report strained personal relationships, not necessarily because of interpersonal conflict, but because illness makes them pull away. This overlap highlights how depression and pain combined can dismantle both physical and social functioning, often beyond what either condition would cause alone. Interestingly, not all depressed individuals experience amplified pain, though rates are high. The variation seems tied to how rumination and self-blame interact with bodily sensations. People prone to repetitive negative thought loops may fixate on discomfort signals, replaying them mentally in the same way they replay mistakes and regrets. This fixation enhances pain salience. Attention magnifies sensation. The more focus devoted to aches, the more noticeable and distressing they become. In non-depressed states, distraction helps lessen pain perception. In depression, relentless focus on the body undermines this buffer. Clinicians witnessing these patterns caution against treating depression-linked pain purely with medication. While analgesics may dull the raw signals somewhat, they cannot address the amplifying brain mechanisms. This is why many patients with depression describe limited relief from painkillers. The medication lowers input, but the amplifying system still exaggerates whatever remains. Therapeutic approaches that reduce depressive symptoms, whether through pharmacological treatments adjusting serotonin and norepinephrine, or psychological approaches reducing rumination, bring more measurable relief. It's not two separate disorders colliding. It's one interconnected system responding in multiple domains. The implication of this conjoined system is that healing pathways must cross boundaries. An interdisciplinary approach is emerging in treatment centers that addresses mood and pain simultaneously. Psychological therapy targeted at cognitive distortions reduces mental magnification of pain. Physical rehabilitation prevents deconditioning of muscles that would otherwise worsen pain perception. Pharmacological treatment adjusts neurotransmitter availability to dampen both symptoms at once. Using integrated methods, patients report greater relief than when either condition is treated in isolation. Another key insight is how inflammation may bridge the two experiences. Elevated inflammatory markers are observed in both depression and chronic pain. These markers sensitize pain pathways and alter neurotransmitter systems, creating a shared biological foundation for both conditions. Depression, then, isn't only amplifying pain through altered processing, but also through parallel changes in body chemistry that prime the nervous system for discomfort. Lifestyle factors which reduce inflammation, diet, activity, and sleep regulation, can help reduce both mood symptoms and perceived pain. Intensity. This highlights once again how interconnected the systems are, extending beyond the brain into the immune response. From the patient perspective, acknowledging the connection can change self-understanding. Many describe frustration at being told their pain has no cause. Recognizing that the pain stems from altered processing rather than absence of cause reframes the experience. It validates the reality of the pain while opening pathways for treatment that target depression. This shift reduces self-doubt and removes the stigma of psychosomatic labels, offering clearer grounds for support. The most important outcome of the 2025 findings is that pain without injury is not a mystery symptom. It is a central part of depression for many people. Amplification through altered pathways and chemistry explains why discomfort persists despite normal scans. It also explains the tight statistical bond between chronic pain and depressive disorders seen across populations. What appears medically confusing at the surface becomes clearer once viewed as a disruption in how the brain perceives and regulates discomfort. Understanding this relationship changes how we look at patients who report persistent aches while showing no visible injury. Instead of dismissing symptoms as exaggerated, clinicians increasingly see them as part of depression's broader reach into both mind and body. Pain management strategies alone may fail if the depression driving amplification remains untreated. Likewise, mood treatments alone may help, but won't succeed fully unless pain relief is addressed. Recognizing depression's strange relationship with pain, the way signals are exaggerated, magnified, and reinterpreted, creates an opportunity to break the feedback loop. And breaking that loop raises another central question about depression. If it increases pain perception and drains energy, why does it so often push people to withdraw from the very social connections that could soften the impact? The withdrawn social pattern. Why does depression so often lead people to withdraw from others, when relationships are one of the strongest protective factors for mental health? On the surface, it seems contradictory. If connection can heal, why would someone retreat? Friends may assume it's a matter of motivation or laziness, but the explanation is less obvious. Social withdrawal is not the absence of effort. It is more often a defense, built on how the depressed brain interprets signals from the outside world. Instead of seeing neutral or supportive interactions for what they are, many individuals living with depression misread those moments as negative, even hostile. Avoidance then becomes an understandable, if ultimately harmful, response. In daily life, this can start small. A coworker doesn't smile in the hallway, or a text takes longer to get a reply than expected. For someone in a stable mood, these moments pass unnoticed. But in a depressed state, the brain flags them as confirmation of being disliked, criticized, or burdensome. That reaction is not based on actual rejection, but on distorted perception. Several experiments using brain scanning technologies show that depressed individuals display heightened neural responses in regions associated with threat detection, even when viewing neutral expressions. What to others looks like a blank or calm face can feel, to the depressed brain, like judgment. When the environment feels filled with criticism, isolation begins to look safer than risking social contact. This tendency to withdraw is reinforced by the emotional costs of misreading events. Imagine a person meeting a friend who greets them in a rushed tone. Instead of thinking, they must be preoccupied, the depressed interpretation is, they're angry I reached out. That assumption brings guilt, shame, and anxiety. To avoid future discomfort, the individual decides it's easier not to engage. Over days and weeks, countless small misreadings accumulate, turning social life into a minefield. Eventually, the strategy of retreat appears logical. Fewer interactions mean fewer perceived rejections. Research in 2025 highlights this bias clearly. When participants with depression were shown neutral faces during imaging studies, their brains often responded as though those faces were overtly critical. The amygdala and other regions tied to processing threat showed exaggerated activation. Neutrality didn't register as neutral, it registered as disapproval. This biological miscalibration shows why social withdrawal is less about choosing to be alone and more about trying to escape what feels like constant negative feedback. For the depressed brain, isolation offers short-term relief from perceived danger, even while it deepens the long-term problem. In family life, these patterns create confusion. Loved ones may feel rejected when the depressed person cancels plans or resists conversation. They may interpret avoidance as disinterest or stubbornness. But from the inside, the logic is inverted. The individual avoids because they care. They believe their presence may cause harm, or that their irritability or exhaustion will make others miserable. Isolation is a misguided attempt to protect relationships, not to destroy them. Unfortunately, this strategy backfires. By withdrawing, the depressed person loses access to comfort and validation, while loved ones grow increasingly distant and puzzled. Social withdrawal also interacts with other symptoms. Fatigue makes it harder to keep up with social commitments, while memory problems increase the risk of forgetting birthdays, appointments, or promises. Each slip reinforces a sense of inadequacy, convincing the person that relationships are simply too difficult to maintain. Irritability compounds this outcome as well. If mood swings cause arguments, guilt afterward fuels the belief that staying away is best. What may look straightforward from the outside is in reality a complex pattern of symptoms feeding each other, all pointing toward retreat. These tendencies further intensify in professional and academic settings. Depression often convinces people they are failing at work or school. Each lapse in focus becomes perceived as a sign that they are letting colleagues or classmates down. Avoiding meetings, group work, or even basic communication looks safer than risking perceived exposure of incompetence. Withdrawal here is not meant to harm productivity, but to preempt humiliation. Again, the loop strengthens itself. Retreating stunts progress, and reduced role performance then deepens self-criticism, which triggers more withdrawal. Isolation may also appear attractive because it controls stimulation. In depressive states, even routine social interactions can feel overwhelming. Small talk requires cognitive flexibility, humor requires spontaneity, and both of those systems are hampered during depression. Struggling through such situations leaves people drained and self-critical. Retreating to a quiet room removes those challenges. Unfortunately, extended withdrawal strips away opportunities to gain positive reinforcement, leaving the person with fewer chances to experience joy, laughter, or support. The absence of input gradually reinforces despair. Patterns of social withdrawal have been studied across cultures, and while details vary, the protective strategy remains consistent. In many societies, expressions of distress carry stigma, so retreat protects the individual from judgment. But retreat also prevents people from accessing resources within their communities. The paradox becomes plain. The defense succeeds in reducing immediate exposure, but ultimately extends suffering by cutting people off from care. What feels like a shield becomes a barrier to recovery. Clinicians stress that withdrawal is not passivity. It is active avoidance grounded in misperception. The depressed brain overestimates social threat and underestimates relational safety. In therapy, one common goal is retraining perception so that neutral or ambiguous events are not automatically read as negative. Exercises may involve practicing real-time interpretation, slowing down the rush to assume rejection. By gradually testing whether social contacts are actually critical, individuals relearn that many interactions are neutral or supportive. Over time, these new experiences begin to balance the distorted brain patterns. The consequences of long-term withdrawal can be severe. Depression already distorts self-worth, and isolation fosters confirmation. Absent feedback from others, individuals lean even more heavily on their negative internal monologues. Without relational correction, distorted beliefs harden. Someone who feels unlovable, and then avoids evidence to the contrary, convinces themselves the belief must be true. Isolation then transforms from temporary protection into entrenched lifestyle. Relationships fade, social networks shrink, and loneliness itself becomes an independent risk factor, worsening mental and physical health. This is why clinicians often treat social withdrawal as one of the most dangerous tracks depression can take. Some researchers emphasize the role of evolutionary psychology in explaining these defenses. Humans are highly sensitive to social belonging because exclusion historically meant survival risk. In this light, misinterpreting neutrality as rejection makes sense. Better to assume hostility and avoid it than risk being ejected from the group. Depression appears to exaggerate this sensitivity, pushing survival instincts into overdrive. While not adaptive in today's world, the mechanism illustrates how ancient systems designed to keep us safe can malfunction under stress. The outcome is an oversupply of caution that drives people to solitude, even when connection is safe and beneficial. Understanding this does not make withdrawal less harmful, but it highlights why blaming someone for not trying hard enough misses the point. The depressed brain isn't avoiding fun. It is overprotecting against perceived social threat, even when none exists. Awareness of that mechanism is crucial for loved ones. Instead of concluding that the withdrawn person doesn't care, they can see that person as bracing against imagined judgment. Patience and gentle connection matter more than pressure, since pressure can reinforce the sense of threat. Recovery often begins not with loud intervention, but with steady reminders that safety and acceptance are still available. One irony of depression is that the very experiences that could help shift perspective, moments of kindness, reassurance, and laughter, are the ones least accessible when withdrawal takes hold. This explains why treatment approaches often include structured group activities, even small ones like group walks or shared meals in therapy contexts. The external framework reduces the need for the depressed person to initiate, while still offering the corrective experiences needed to recalibrate perception. Over time, these small social exposures contradict the brain's assumption that every interaction is a risk, loosening the cycle of withdrawal. The 2025 findings on perception biases provide a clearer biological route to what many patients describe subjectively. The world looks harsher, people look colder, and interactions feel judgmental. These experiences are not simply mood-driven exaggerations. They stem from altered patterns in brain circuits, tasked with interpreting facial cues. Knowing this, depression can be reframed not as avoidance rooted in poor character, but as a disorder that warps the very filters through which people see each other. And once you recognize that distorted filters drive withdrawal, another question naturally emerges. What happens to decision-making when the same filters begin paralyzing even the smallest choices of everyday life? Word count, 1094. Decision-making under siege. Ever had one of those mornings where you can't even decide whether to make coffee or tea, so you just stand there staring at the cupboard until you give up altogether? For many people with depression, that moment isn't occasional hesitation, it's a daily barrier. Choices that should be effortless like what to eat for breakfast or which shirt to wear, suddenly feel like mountain-sized problems. And this isn't just indecision for its own sake. It reflects deeper changes in how the depressed brain regulates flexibility, reward, and motivation. Decision-making is usually thought of as a rational process. You weigh options, consider consequences, and commit. But beneath the surface, our brains depend on something called cognitive flexibility, the ability to shift between choices, evaluate them, and execute a decision without getting stuck. Cognitive flexibility makes it possible to handle uncertainty and keep moving forward rather than circling endlessly through what-ifs. For someone living with depression, this flexibility is harder to access. The machinery is slowed not because of lack of intelligence, but because the systems that fuel motivation and focus are impaired. We tend to underestimate how much even small decisions require those systems. Ordering food at a restaurant involves scanning options, remembering likes and dislikes, then predicting which meal will be satisfying. Normally, dopamine systems support this by nudging the brain toward reward expectancy. That surge of motivational drive is what makes choosing lunch quick instead of paralyzing. In depression, these dopamine pathways operate differently. The motivational push doesn't arrive in the same volume, leaving the brain less able to prioritize or pursue rewards. Without that chemical support, weighing options feels heavier. Every possibility demands equal attention, making it harder to rule any out. This is why people with depression often describe feeling stuck. Stuck doesn't mean refusing decisions or being picky. It means the internal gears that normally propel a person to choose have jammed. Everyday tasks stretch into long sessions of hesitation. Should I reply to this email immediately or later? Should I vacuum now or after dinner? These questions freeze someone midstream, sometimes leading them to avoid deciding at all. That avoidance is not laziness, but the easiest available exit from a paralyzed system. The connection between dopamine and decision paralysis has been highlighted in recent studies. What researchers see is that depression reduces the responsiveness of reward circuits that normally power choice. The circuits don't send clear signals about which option is better, so people end up staring at multiple options without bias. Under normal conditions, dopamine creates preference and momentum. Without it, choices flatten. Every option looks equally neutral, and the brain keeps spinning instead of advancing. This lack of bias makes finalizing decisions exhausting. The consequences reach far beyond meal choices. In professional settings, the inability to decide can stall productivity. A depressed student may spend hours deciding how to start an essay, losing time without writing a word. A worker may procrastinate simple tasks, not because of carelessness, but because every option for action feels equally overwhelming. This cumulative hesitation feeds into guilt. People believe they are procrastinating because they are lazy, when in fact they are trapped in chemically altered motivational circuits. That self-judgment multiplies the burden, reinforcing depression's cycle. Another challenge is how decision paralysis interacts with rumination. When the brain cannot decide, it turns inward, trying to analyze options more intensely in hopes of breaking the deadlock. But instead of resolution, the analysis becomes rumination. The more someone cycles through possibilities, the heavier the loop becomes, reinforcing the stuckness. So every small indecision is likely to spiral into brooding, where energy drains but no outcome is chosen. It's decision-making under siege, with self-criticism waiting at the end. We can see this in basic daily scenarios. Imagine deciding what to eat for dinner. A non-depressed person might glance at the fridge, choose pasta, and get cooking. Someone with depression might stand there scanning items without commitment. If I make pasta, will it make me bloated? If I skip cooking, am I wasting money? If I order takeout, am I being irresponsible? Each path triggers another layer of guilt, so none provide relief. After 20 minutes of internal debate, the energy to cook anything is gone, and the person goes to bed hungry or eats something unsatisfying. The issue wasn't food, it was the mental cost of choosing. This extended cost shows up in reports from patients describing even grocery shopping as overwhelming. Too many options line the shelves, each requiring a decision. Cereal A or cereal B? Which is healthier, which is cheaper, which is more filling? For people without depression, these processes run in the background, supported by dopamine's nudging force. For those with depression, every item must be considered consciously because the reward bias doesn't simplify the field. That conscious consideration is mentally draining. Just one shopping trip can feel like an exhausting feat of willpower. It's also important to note that not all decisions become equally paralyzing. High-stakes, emotionally charged decisions may be no harder than the mundane ones. This is because in depression, decision-making fatigue applies even to minor details, not only to major life events. What most people breeze through without thought, like choosing a route to walk to work, can become a decision that feels impossible. The weight doesn't scale with importance. It scales with impaired systems that support initiative. From a neurological standpoint, altered dopamine signaling is not the only mechanism at play. Prefrontal regions involved in evaluating and integrating information also show reduced communication in depression. This reduced connectivity means the brain isn't integrating context efficiently, making each choice feel isolated and harder to connect into a structured decision. Without proper integration, even yes or no choices seem to require unending debate. That inefficiency is why decisions drag on until exhaustion overtakes momentum. The longer this continues, the worse the feedback loop becomes. Because delayed decisions often lead to missed opportunities or errors, depressed individuals then receive external consequences. Missed deadlines, late responses, or neglected responsibilities feed back into guilt and reinforce the sense of incompetence. This, in turn, creates more hesitation the next time, since the individual believes failure is inevitable. The anticipation of failure itself paralyzes decision-making further. In this way, impaired cognitive flexibility is both a consequence and a driver of worsening depression. Therapists observing these patterns focus heavily on breaking decision paralysis into smaller steps. Instead of confronting overwhelming choices, individuals are encouraged to simplify decisions down to concrete strategies. Picking between two options, setting time limits, or relying on external prompts to initiate action. These tools don't instantly restore dopamine function, but they provide structural supports that limit the drain of overthinking. Over time, practice builds tolerance for choosing despite the poverty of motivational push. Interestingly, decision-making impairment is also tied to anhedonia, the loss of pleasure. When nothing feels rewarding, choices lose value. Why decide what to eat if no option seems likely to bring enjoyment? This absence of anticipated reward is another dimension of why decisions stall. Without the spark of motivation from anticipating a positive outcome, initiating a choice feels meaningless. Depression doesn't only suppress mood, it suppresses the expected value of decisions. That suppression explains why individuals often disengage altogether rather than struggle through indecision. Another insight from research is how decision problems tie directly into social withdrawal. Conversations and relationships require constant small decisions. What to say next, how to respond, whether to reach out. When brain systems labor under impaired flexibility, even these decisions feel burdensome. Avoiding social interaction then becomes another protective response to decision fatigue. Withdrawing saves cognitive energy, but it cuts off the very support that might help. Again, we see symptoms linking together into self-reinforcing systems. From the outside, decision paralysis can look trivial. Friends wonder why someone can't just pick something already. But this perspective overlooks the neurological restrictions involved. Depression's hold on decision-making is not about preferring indecision. It is about struggling to organize information and pursue rewards without the usual chemical drive. Without that drive, each choice drags on until fatigue decides for you, usually by avoiding the choice altogether. Decision-making under siege is therefore one of depression's hidden costs. It undermines productivity, disrupts relationships, and steals confidence, not through visible sadness, but through quiet immobility. The depressed brain, operating with low dopamine and limited connectivity, cannot propel itself into the everyday flow of choice without massive effort. What others see as laziness or stalling is, in fact, a brain caught in a biochemical standoff, unable to tip the scales. Recognizing this transforms how we interpret hesitation in depression. Instead of blaming someone for procrastination, we can see indecision as a direct symptom of the disorder. Supporting them means reducing choice overload, providing structured environments, and substituting motivational deficits with external cues. These small changes break the cycle, allowing the brain to regain some momentum. And once you understand how decision-making falters in depression, it raises an even more intriguing question. Could future treatments rely on brain scans and neural signatures, offering direct evidence of these impairments instead of depending solely on self-reported experiences? The neurological marker breakthrough. Could depression one day be diagnosed not just through questionnaires, but by scanning the brain itself? For decades, psychiatry has relied on checklists of symptoms, self-reports, and clinical judgment to decide whether someone is struggling with depression. These methods help identify patterns, but they are vulnerable to overlap with other conditions and can miss people who don't describe their experience in the expected way. That gap in precision is why so much attention is now focused on the search for objective neurological markers, biological fingerprints of depression that could be measured directly. In 2025, research teams reported consistent neural signatures, particularly in the circuits involved with guilt and rumination. Those signals bring psychiatry closer to tools that may confirm a diagnosis with the same kind of objectivity used in physical medicine. For a long time, mood disorders resisted this kind of approach. Unlike broken bones or tumors, depression doesn't show up clearly on traditional scans. Psychological testing became the best available method, but questionnaires depend heavily on what a person is aware of and willing to report. A patient who doesn't connect their irritability or memory failures with depression may go unrecognized. Others may describe physical pain or fatigue to medical doctors without mentioning mood at all. The result has been a patchwork of underdiagnosis and misclassification. That is what makes the discovery of repeatable neural patterns so striking. Where once depression was understood only through behavior and self-description, researchers are beginning to identify markers that can be measured directly. The key circuits under investigation revolve around guilt and rumination. These cognitive patterns are not unique to depression, but the way they operate in the depressed brain appears notably different. In earlier small-scale studies, guilt processing was found to misfire. Brain regions responsible for evaluating mistakes and their context did not synchronize as expected. A person could feel the emotional sting of guilt without the balancing sense of perspective that helps put mistakes into proportion. In 2025, larger imaging projects replicated these findings in broader populations, showing that this miscoordination isn't just a quirk in small samples, but a consistent characteristic of depressive disorders. Rumination adds another dimension. It is more than repetitive thinking. It is persistent activity in self-referential networks of the brain. Healthy problem-solving activates these networks temporarily and then quiets them once a solution is reached. In depression, the off switch looks impaired. Networks remain active long after no progress is being made, producing the hamster wheel sensation that drains working memory and decision-making. Imaging consistently shows prolonged activation in these regions when depressed participants are asked to reflect on personal scenarios compared to non-depressed controls. Across different labs and scanning methods, this persistence evolves into a marker, a measurable difference in how the brain handles repetitive thought. Combining these two findings paints an important picture. Depression may be identifiable by the dual signature of overactive rumination circuits and undercoordinated guilt processing. Neither by itself explains the disorder, but together they create a recognizable pattern, visible in brain imaging. Unlike self-report, this pattern doesn't depend on how a person describes their symptoms. Even someone who frames their problems purely as physical fatigue could show the same neural signature, guiding doctors to the underlying condition faster. The promise of these discoveries has drawn comparisons to other fields of medicine. Conditions like diabetes or high blood pressure are verified through measurable biomarkers: blood sugar levels, blood pressure readings, visible organ changes. Psychiatry, however, has historically lacked these anchors. Diagnosis relied on clustering observable behaviors, which sometimes blurred boundaries between depression, anxiety, or even attention deficit conditions. The consistent identification of neural signatures in guilty self-focus and rumination offers psychiatry a foothold in the biomarker era. Instead of asking only what a patient feels, clinicians may someday pair those reports with objective evidence from scans. Why does this matter so much? For one, it could reduce misdiagnosis. Depression and anxiety overlap significantly, with both involving worry and negative thought loops. But the specifics of rumination, the backward-focused replaying versus the forward-focused worry, engage distinct networks in the brain. Scans that identify which circuits are malfunctioning may distinguish between primarily depressive patterns and primarily anxious ones, helping to tailor treatment more precisely. Right now, many patients cycle through different medications and therapies in a process of trial and error. Biomarkers could shorten that cycle by matching people to interventions aligned with their brain's specific activity patterns. Second, objective markers create opportunities for earlier intervention. Many individuals live with depression for months or even years before recognizing it. If brain imaging or other neurological tools detect altered guilt processing or persistent rumination activity earlier, intervention can begin sooner, reducing the chance of entrenched illness. Think of how blood tests can identify elevated cholesterol years before a heart attack. In the same way, neural markers could identify risk before depression reaches disabling levels. The 2025 research also raises interesting possibilities about tracking progress. If guilt and rumination circuits normalize with treatment, scans might show that improvement even before patients report feeling better. This would give clinicians a way to measure under-the-surface recovery and adjust treatment more confidently. For patients, seeing tangible changes in brain activity could also reduce stigma, demonstrating that depression has physical correlates as real as other medical conditions. Of course, there are challenges. Brain scans remain expensive and not always practical for routine checkups. And depression is not identical across individuals. Some may not show the exact same neural markers, and over-relying on scans could risk missing cases that present differently. Yet the consistency seen so far suggests that even if the markers are not universal, they cover a large proportion of cases. Ongoing studies aim to increase sample diversity and refine which patterns are most reliable for diagnosis across age, culture, and severity. Another concern is interpretation. Just because a brain region activates differently does not mean it can fully stand in for all aspects of depression. Human experience is complex, shaped by biology, environment, and personal history. Neural signatures add detail to the biological side, but cannot cover the entire landscape of the disorder alone. This is why most experts envision them as supplements to existing methods, rather than outright replacements. The future may not involve doctors diagnosing depression exclusively from a scan, but using scans to strengthen the evidence collected from dialogue and reports. One exciting direction is the effort to find related markers outside expensive imaging labs. Researchers are testing wearable technologies that might indirectly track neural rhythm disruptions through patterns in sleep, stress responses, or attention. If guilt and rumination circuits leave detectable traces in other biological systems, future devices may offer an accessible way to flag early risk. The brain scan findings drive this effort, providing a blueprint of where to look for peripheral signals. Without such established neural markers, those explorations would be aimless. The introduction of neural signatures also reframes the way patients think about their own symptoms. Rumination and guilt may feel like character flaws or bad habits, but seeing them tied to specific brain circuits highlights that they are symptoms of altered functioning, not moral shortcomings. This can lessen self-blame, shifting the narrative from, "I'm weak for thinking this way," to "my brain is caught in a loop that science can measure and eventually help correct." For many, that shift is a powerful relief. The possibility of linking depression to consistent brain patterns also expands research on treatment approaches. If scans show which circuits are most disrupted, therapies could be designed to directly retrain them. Already, experimental brain stimulation techniques target relevant networks, aiming to calm rumination or rebalance guilt processing. When paired with biomarkers, such treatments can be tailored more efficiently. Patients could be selected for interventions based on whether scans confirm relevant disruptions. This precision promises to reduce the frustration many patients face when first seeking care. Instead of trying one medication after another without clear guidance, neural markers may guide clinicians toward the most effective starting points. Over time, this could shorten the duration of untreated depression, limiting impact on work, relationships, and physical health. The larger picture here is a shift in psychiatry from descriptive to measurable science. For centuries, depression has been identified by words, descriptions of how people feel and behave. By isolating neural markers, the field begins to anchor those descriptions in tangible systems. Patients may one day look back and wonder how clinicians once relied only on personal accounts without supporting biological evidence. The discovery of consistent signatures in guilt and rumination circuits is a step in that direction. While practical use may still be years away, the trend is clear. Questionnaires will remain part of diagnosis because they capture personal experience, but the future likely pairs them with scans or biomarkers that confirm what words alone cannot. Imagine a treatment plan informed not just by, "I feel tired and hopeless," but by the evidence that guilt circuits are misfiring and rumination networks are persistently overactive. That combination of subjective report and objective evidence could finally bring psychiatry closer to the level of precision seen in other medical domains. The breakthrough of 2025 does not end the story of depression. It gives the field a clearer starting point. It shows that patterns once thought of as intangible, feelings of guilt, cycles of thought, correspond to measurable changes in the brain. This evidence moves depression away from being viewed as solely psychological and into the larger territory of medical conditions with identifiable signatures. And that shift naturally leads to another question. If guilt and rumination circuits overlap with worry and brooding in such distinct ways, why do so many people diagnosed with depression also meet criteria for anxiety at the same time? Why anxiety and depression travel together? Why is it that so many people diagnosed with depression also end up meeting criteria for anxiety? The overlap is so frequent that doctors often expect to see both conditions together rather than separately. On the surface, the two disorders look distinct. Depression is defined largely by low mood, fatigue, and self-blame, while anxiety centers on constant worry, restlessness, and fear of what could go wrong. Yet the data consistently show that the majority of patients experience both. If the symptoms are different, then why do they travel together so often? The conflict lies in the way their boundaries blur in everyday life. Someone with depression may describe days filled with exhaustion and hopelessness, yet also report nagging worries about the future. Someone diagnosed with generalized anxiety may talk about constant fear of losing control, but also admit to struggling with motivation and emptiness. Clinicians face the question of whether these are two full conditions overlapping or two different expressions of the same underlying system. Until recently, explanations rested mostly on observation. Patients who had one condition showed high risk for the other, but the reason remained uncertain. Newer research has begun to connect that overlap to shared mental processes, especially rumination. Rumination, the repetitive cycling of thoughts without closure, shows up strongly in both disorders, but it takes different directions. In depression, the cycles usually travel backwards, replaying mistakes, regrets, or perceived failures. In anxiety, the loops travel forward, imagining what could go wrong, magnifying risks, and rehearsing disaster scenarios. In both cases, the person feels trapped in endless thought. The content differs, past-oriented for depression, future-oriented for anxiety, but the machinery is the same. The brain cannot switch off repetitive processing, so attention gets locked into unresolvable loops. This shared mechanism helps explain why patients rarely have one disorder without the other. Researchers in 2025 provided clearer evidence for this by comparing brain activity patterns across groups diagnosed with depression, anxiety, or both. They found that the same self-referential networks lit up in all groups when participants engaged in repetitive thinking tasks. These were the default mode networks of the brain, regions responsible for introspection, self-evaluation, and memory linking. In depression, the loops held onto self-criticism and guilt. In anxiety, they held on to threat anticipation. But in both, the networks showed prolonged activation compared to non-affected participants. The persistence itself, the inability to quiet these circuits, was the abnormality tying the two conditions together. To understand why this matters, think of the brain as a city with traffic. Most people have mental traffic during stressful moments, but it clears away once resolution is reached. In depression and anxiety, the mental traffic lights seem broken. Cars keep circling, intersections stay jammed, and nothing moves forward. The content of the gridlock changes, sometimes focused on past mistakes, other times on future dangers. But the inability to clear the roads is what unites the two. That failure to disengage from rumination explains why both disorders feel exhausting. It is not only the sadness or worry, it is the unrelenting mental effort of circling without progress. The impact shows up clearly in working memory tasks. People with depression often struggle to hold details because rumination about past events consumes attention. People with anxiety report the same problem, but for them the mental space is filled with fear of what might happen next. Both conditions produce impaired cognition for the same basic reason. Mental capacity is drained by repetitive loops. The fact that both disorders damage memory, focus, and decision-making in similar ways supports the idea of a shared mechanism. What we describe outwardly as two conditions may be two faces of the same circuit dysfunction. Another clue comes from the emotional response to uncertainty. Anxiety exaggerates the threat of what might go wrong, while depression exaggerates the certainty that failure has already occurred. Yet both originate in hypersensitivity to ambiguity. A simple silence in conversation, a delayed text, or an ambiguous facial expression can trigger spirals. The anxious person worries endlessly about what might be meant, while the depressed person concludes they are disliked or at fault. Different content, same distorted processing. Both sets of responses are linked to miscalibrated activity in the brain's threat detection and self-evaluation systems. Clinicians find this overlap significant not just for understanding, but also for treatment. If rumination is the shared pathway, then interventions that interrupt it could address both disorders at once. Techniques used in cognitive behavioral therapy, such as thought labeling or postponing worry, are designed to break the cycle of repetition. Similarly, mindfulness strategies train attention to shift away from loops and refocus on immediate stimuli. In practice, these methods reduce depressive brooding and anxious worrying simultaneously, reinforcing the idea that the disorders overlap in mechanism even when symptoms differ. The overlap extends to biology as well. Neurochemical systems such as serotonin and norepinephrine influence mood, but they also modulate the brain's alertness to potential threats. When these systems are out of balance, circuits that normally calm intrusive thoughts fail to regulate properly. This leaves individuals vulnerable both to the repetitive guilt of depression and the repetitive worry of anxiety. Disrupted dopamine signaling also reduces reward anticipation in depression and increases uncertainty intolerance in anxiety. When multiple neurotransmitter systems fall out of balance, it becomes clear why the two conditions appear together so often. From a patient's perspective, the co-occurrence creates confusion. Someone may walk into therapy saying they feel anxious all the time, unable to stop worrying. As sessions progress, they realize much of their day is actually spent in hopeless reflection about the past. Another patient may insist they are depressed but deny anxiety, only to describe constant struggles with restlessness at night because they can't stop thinking about what's going to go wrong tomorrow. The border blurs within individuals because the repetitive machinery feeds both directions of thought. The distinction clinicians make on paper doesn't feel clean inside a lived experience. Take an example from everyday life. A college student might ruminate over a poor exam grade. Depression drives the thought backward. I failed because I'm not smart enough. I always mess things up. I'm hopeless. Anxiety drives it forward. If I failed this one, I'll fail the next. If I fail again, I'll lose my scholarship and everything will collapse. Both streams start with the same event. Both rely on the same neural networks. The difference is only the direction of travel in time. To the student, both are crushing. And together, they create a cycle that is nearly impossible to escape without outside help. The merging of depression and anxiety has consequences beyond individual suffering. In workplaces, comorbid symptoms reduce productivity more than either condition alone. At a population level, the overlap increases healthcare costs because patients cycle through specialists treating fatigue, pain, digestive complaints, or insomnia without recognizing a shared root. The strain on public health systems is compounded by this duality, making it one of the most expensive combinations of mental health disorders globally. Understanding the common pathway is not just an academic exercise. It has real implications for how societies address both conditions. One major insight from the 2025 data is that the brain may default to repetitive patterns as a misguided problem-solving attempt. When threatened, human cognition evolved to analyze situations repeatedly to avoid danger. This was useful when survival relied on remembering where predators lurked. But in modern contexts, the same mechanism catches on mundane stressors: missed deadlines, social awkwardness, ambiguous emails. The brain keeps revisiting them endlessly, as if more thought will produce safety. Depression and anxiety reflect adaptation's misfiring, with the same underlying machine applying its function to different time frames. Therapies that target this machine directly appear especially promising. Attention training exercises, structured problem solving, and behavioral activation all aim to redirect energy away from repetition. Emerging digital tools even track ruminative speech or thought patterns through journaling apps, offering prompts to break cycles. These interventions work whether loops are future-focused or past-focused, showing how shared mechanisms create shared solutions. By treating the repetitive process itself, clinicians can reduce the impact of both conditions together rather than addressing them in isolation. The idea that depression and anxiety share ground also helps reduce stigma. Patients often worry that being diagnosed with two conditions means they are doubly broken. Realizing instead that both emerge from the same malfunctioning pathways clarifies the experience. It is not two separate illnesses stacked up, but one system overactivating in different directions. This framing brings coherence to what can otherwise feel like chaos. It also reassures patients that treatment targeting common circuits can make progress on both, without needing two entirely different approaches. Of course, not every patient experiences both equally. Some lean heavily toward depressive symptoms, others toward anxiety. But the large number with mixed features shows that separation is less sharp than diagnostic categories suggest. Future versions of psychiatric manuals may describe them not as fully distinct disorders, but as separate expressions of dysfunction in shared networks. Labels may adjust, but the practical goal remains the same: understanding how minds get trapped in loops and how to free them. The co-occurrence of depression and anxiety illustrates how mental health cannot be neatly divided into categories. Both disorders involve heavy emotional costs, yet their shared process, rumination, bridges the gap. The repeated findings from 2025 strengthen the case that anxiety and depression are not only neighbors, but housemates, living in the same circuits of the brain. Guilt, fear, and endless looping create a powerful alliance, one that explains why so many patients struggle with both at once. And when those loops define thought patterns, they also lay the groundwork for another feature of depression: the cognitive distortions that repeat like habits until they feel indistinguishable from truth. Cognitive distortions as habit loops. Imagine you text a friend, and hours go by without a reply. For most people, this delay is a small inconvenience. Maybe the friend is busy or forgot to check their phone. But when depression enters the picture, that silence doesn't stay neutral. It quickly spirals into a story. They're annoyed at me, then they don't actually like me, and sometimes all the way to I'm unlovable. The friend's lateness hasn't said any of this, yet the depressed mind fills in the gaps automatically. This is an example of a cognitive distortion. Thought patterns that consistently tell inaccurate and exaggerated versions of reality, and then repeat themselves until they feel true. Cognitive distortions aren't rare. They are habitual misinterpretations of events that feel convincing because they repeat so much. Instead of evaluating evidence, the depressed brain runs familiar scripts. These scripts become mental shortcuts, offering quick but inaccurate conclusions. It's not unusual to see patterns like, if I struggle today, I'll always fail, or if they didn't smile, they must dislike me. The issue isn't that these thoughts pop up once in a while. The issue is that they appear automatically, and because they repeat over and over, they seem real despite lacking support. One of the most common distortions is catastrophizing. In ordinary thinking, someone might acknowledge a mistake at work and resolve to correct it. But under distortion, the mistake becomes an imagined avalanche. I messed up this report, so my boss will think I'm incompetent, and soon I'll lose my job. The emotional response attached to this thought isn't proportionate to the situation. But because the thought repeats, the brain treats the scenario as if it's inevitable. This repetition builds anxiety on top of depression, fueling hopelessness while eroding problem-solving skills. Another distortion is all-or-nothing thinking. Instead of seeing performance or effort along a spectrum, events are judged as total success or complete failure. A depressed student who misses one assignment may not think, I slipped, but I can recover. Instead, they reach the distorted conclusion, I'm terrible at school. I'll never do well. This pattern makes ordinary setbacks feed directly into identity. Over time, the habit of radical conclusions about oneself strengthens, making flexibility harder. Personalization is another common loop. Here, unrelated events are interpreted as personal failures. A partner might seem distracted after a long day, but the depressed brain immediately concludes, it's my fault. I must have upset them. The partner's mood may have nothing to do with the relationship, but the pattern insists on filtering it as self-blame. This distortion meshes with the guilt processing problems already seen in depression, giving guilt more material to latch onto even when circumstances don't warrant it. What makes these distortions so powerful is how they reinforce each other. Catastrophizing, for example, often blends with all-or-nothing thinking. Missing one step doesn't only predict disaster, it also predicts that a person is fundamentally defective. Once these distortions align, they loop into rumination. The brain doesn't simply think them once and move forward. It replays them again and again until the distortion feels indistinguishable from objective truth. Psychologists now view these thought errors not just as fragments, but as habit loops. Like physical habits, biting your nails, checking your phone at every pause, cognitive distortions have triggers and routines that follow predictable tracks. The trigger might be a moment of social ambiguity, like a late text or an unread email. The routine is the distortion. They must not care about me. The reward, ironically, is the sense of closure. The brain feels like it solved the uncertainty, even though it solved it with an inaccurate conclusion. Because a kind of closure is achieved, the loop gets reinforced. Next time, the brain repeats the same distorted shortcut. Treating distortions as habit loops changes the way psychologists address them. Instead of telling patients to just think positive, the focus shifts to identifying the loop structure and then retraining it. One therapy approach involves recognizing the trigger, naming the distortion pattern, and practicing alternative routines. For example, instead of personalizing a delayed text reply, the alternative routine is to acknowledge the uncertainty. There are many reasons for this delay, and none of them confirm that I'm unlovable. Rehearsing this alternative response weakens the automatic habit. Over time, repetition establishes more balanced thought loops in place of distorted ones. Identifying distortions is difficult because they arrive dressed as truth. If someone hears, "I'm unlovable," enough times in their head, it eventually feels like an observation rather than an assumption. What keeps it convincing is the sheer frequency of repetition. Each time the brain cycles through the thought, it strengthens the connection between event and conclusion. This is why distortions linger so strongly. They are more than fleeting errors. They are well-rehearsed shortcuts that the brain has practiced thousands of times. Each distortion style also affects behavior. A person caught in all-or-nothing loops might avoid challenges entirely. If success is seen as the only acceptable outcome, any risk of failure feels unbearable. Catastrophizing keeps individuals locked into constant pre-disaster planning, unable to engage with real present tasks. Personalization can erode relationships, as the constant assumption of being at fault creates guilt-heavy dynamics with others. Each pattern sustains depression, not just by shaping thoughts, but by constraining what actions feel possible. Importantly, distortions do not mean a person is incapable of rational thought. Many individuals with depression can recognize the irrationality of these loops when asked directly. But recognition doesn't automatically disrupt the habit. This is where therapy techniques aim to slow the cycle. Practices like recording distortions in a journal, labeling them explicitly, and rehearsing counterthoughts help weaken the automatic response. Like breaking any habit, the process takes persistence, but gradual improvement is observed as people gain tools to pause the automatic slide into distorted conclusions. One way to visualize the process is to think of grooves on a record. Each time a distortion repeats, the thought wears its path deeper into the brain's processing systems. This makes the thought loop quicker to activate and harder to exit, even when the person knows it's unfair. Training alternative thoughts is the equivalent of cutting new grooves. At first, it feels unnatural or forced, but the more those grooves are repeated, the easier the brain follows them automatically. Eventually, the older distortion grooves fade in influence. The 2025 perspective treats distortions not only as symptoms, but also intervention targets. If depression worsens when distortions are rehearsed automatically, then treatment focuses on disrupting rehearsal. Some therapeutic programs now incorporate habit reversal strategies originally developed for physical compulsions. Patients practice spotting the trigger moment in real time, the unread text, the neutral face, and then implementing a short-circuit response, like deliberately stating several non-self-critical explanations. These substitutions weaken the closure reward that distortion once offered and replace it with a healthier frame. Patients often describe liberation when they realize distortions are patterns rather than revelations. Instead of believing, "I always think this, so it must be true," they learn, "I always think this because my brain has practiced it into habit." That reframing transforms distortions from permanent features of identity into patterns open to change. By shifting the interpretation away from truth claims and toward practiced routines, individuals reclaim a sense of agency. Additionally, Research shows that practicing new thought loops doesn't just change subjective experience. Brain imaging reveals shifts in connectivity between frontal evaluation areas and emotional centers when patients improve at countering distortions. This suggests that retraining habits is not only psychological but also biological. The circuits themselves adjust in response to new repetition. The same mechanism that first carved the distortion grooves can be recruited to carve more accurate and compassionate ones. In real-world terms, the habit loop framing allows individuals concrete steps. Instead of asking themselves abstractly whether they are worthy or lovable, they focus on interrupting the loop in small daily events. Each disrupted cycle builds momentum. If every late text no longer produces, "I'm unlovable," then distortions lose their power of constant reinforcement. Depression then loses one of its strongest engines. The process, however, takes patience. Just as physical habits are difficult to break, cognitive habits resist change. Early attempts feel clumsy and insincere, but the evidence suggests that repetition in a healthier direction works, even if belief doesn't come instantly. Behavior and cognition reinforce each other, and practice gradually shifts both. Therapy doesn't erase distortions in one step. It replaces them with clearer grooves that, with enough use, override the old ones. These insights illuminate why thought alone is rarely enough to manage depression. Logic can counter a distortion in the moment, but without repeated practice, the habit doesn't weaken. This is why therapy emphasizes structured exercises, daily tracking, and guided practice. The goal is not simply to notice distortions, but to slowly unwind the loops that keep them alive. Over time, what once felt like unquestionable truth, "I'm unlovable, I always fail," reduces into recognized old routines that no longer command the same weight. Depression bends cognition most powerfully through these distortions. They are not random missteps, but patterns built into daily life by repetition. They act like habits of thought, fast and familiar, even when inaccurate. Recognizing them as habit loops gives both clinicians and patients a way forward. Instead of seeing distortions as reflections of reality, they can be treated as rehearsed shortcuts ready to be retrained. And once these patterns begin to loosen, it becomes easier to see how closely depression ties into the body as well as the mind, carrying signals not just in thought, but through processes like chronic inflammation that blur the boundary between biology and psychology. The body-mind messenger connection. Depression may literally weaken your immune system. That might sound unusual at first, since mood and immunity seem like separate categories. One is about thoughts and feelings, the other is about cells and pathogens. Yet when doctors measure inflammatory markers in blood samples, they often find that individuals with depression show levels higher than expected, even when there is no infection in the body. This raises the striking possibility that depression is not only a disorder of the mind, but also one that changes how the body defends itself against illness. The curious part is that this inflammation shows up without the usual cause. Infections, injuries, or autoimmune conditions can trigger the immune system to send out chemical messengers. But in depression, similar signals appear even when no clear threat is present. It is as if the immune system is in a constant state of false alarm. These molecules, called cytokines, are designed to help coordinate defenses against physical dangers, but when they remain chronically elevated, the effect spreads into mood and cognition. Instead of protecting the person, the immune system may be feeding the disorder. One way to think about this link is to consider how inflammation changes behavior during sickness. When you have the flu, the body deliberately promotes fatigue, aches, and withdrawal to conserve energy for recovery. Scientists call this sickness behavior. Depression shares many of the same features: exhaustion, loss of interest, reduced appetite, and isolation. But in depression, these sickness-like symptoms happen without a virus or bacteria driving them. Chronic low-level inflammation produces a similar effect, leaving the body in a sustained state of fatigue and low motivation. What makes this relationship even more fascinating is that inflammation appears both as a cause and consequence of depression. Stressful experiences activate stress hormones like cortisol, which interact with the immune system. Over time, repeated stress blunts cortisol's ability to control inflammation, leaving higher baseline levels of immune activation. Those signals then feed back into the brain, disrupting neurotransmitter systems related to mood and energy. Serotonin and dopamine regulation both appear less efficient when inflammation is chronically elevated. In this sense, inflammation doesn't just accompany depression, it actively deepens its psychological profile. The loop does not stop there. Depression itself increases behaviors that can worsen inflammation. Sleep disruption is common in depressive states. Poor sleep alters immune function, increasing circulating inflammatory compounds. Fatigue then encourages inactivity, which further reduces the body's ability to regulate inflammatory processes. Diet changes toward higher sugar and lower nutrient intake add another layer. Each symptom contributes in small ways, and together they keep inflammation high. In other words, the disorder maintains itself by using the immune system as part of its cycle. Evidence from 2025 demonstrates this with controlled trials showing that depressed participants consistently display higher inflammation markers, even after adjusting for lifestyle differences. This suggests the relationship is not just coincidental or the byproduct of unhealthy habits, but part of the condition itself. The immune system is not just slightly activated, it appears persistently primed. That priming places stress not only on mood regulation, but also on physical health. Elevated inflammation is linked to cardiovascular problems, higher incidence of metabolic disease, and a range of chronic conditions. The connection means that depression may carry physical risks, extending beyond mental distress. Patients often describe this in terms of constant tiredness or body heaviness. But unlike pure fatigue, the discomfort can feel systemic, almost as if the body is signaling illness perpetually. Clinical reports highlight individuals who experience regular aches, headaches, or digestive discomfort despite no clinical findings on scans. Once inflammation is measured, the results reveal that their bodies are operating in stressed states even during rest. The complaint, "I feel sick all the time," may truly reflect how chronic inflammation mimics the immune response to actual illness. There is another dimension to consider: the bidirectional nature of this link. Just as depression can raise inflammation, inflammation alone can provoke depressive symptoms. Medical patients receiving treatments that increase immune activity, such as interferon therapy, frequently report depressive states as side effects. Even without psychological triggers, the chemical messengers of immune activation influence brain regions related to mood. The observation that artificial immune stimulation can induce depression provides strong evidence that inflammation is not just correlated, but causative in some cases. This knowledge reframes how we look at depression in medical settings. Doctors encountering patients with inflammatory conditions like arthritis, irritable bowel disease, or chronic infections see higher rates of depression. It is not only because the illnesses are difficult to live with, but also because the immune activity itself promotes the mood changes. This creates an important clinical reminder that managing inflammation can directly influence mental health outcomes. It also reveals why integrated care, where medical and psychiatric teams collaborate, can be especially effective for patients living with chronic illness. The biological pathway involves communication between the immune system and the brain through chemical signaling, as well as direct nerve routes. The vagus nerve, for example, transmits immune signals directly from the body to the brainstem. Persistent low-grade activation of this pathway maintains a state of vigilance within the brain, altering neurotransmitter balance. In particular, areas responsible for motivation receive dampened dopamine signaling when inflammation levels remain high. The subjective result is loss of drive, one of the core features of depression. It's important to note that not everyone with high inflammation develops depression, and not everyone with depression shows the same inflammatory profile. But the overlap is strong enough that researchers are exploring whether subtypes of depression might be defined by biological characteristics. Patients with measurable immune activation may need different treatments than those without. Anti-inflammatory medications, lifestyle interventions targeting inflammation, and therapies designed to regulate stress hormone function all emerge as promising approaches. By tailoring approaches to the biology present, treatment could become more precise. Another important angle lies in prevention. If sustained stress leaves people vulnerable by exhausting cortisol's ability to suppress inflammation, early interventions aimed at stress reduction would protect both mood and body. Practices like mindfulness, structured exercise, and consistent sleep routines reduce inflammatory signaling, not just in response to infection, but also in daily maintenance. This means mental health care can be seen as part of preventative medicine, not only improving mood, but also lowering inflammation and the broader risks it carries. Findings about inflammation also reshape how stigma is addressed. Many people view depression as purely psychological, implying weakness or lack of character. Showing that immune dysregulation is part of the condition helps dismantle that view. Elevated inflammatory markers provide tangible evidence that depression is embodied, not invented. From this standpoint, telling someone to shake it off is as unrealistic as telling someone with asthma to breathe harder through constricted airways. Biology places limits, and depression must be understood within that framework. The body-mind link becomes clearer when we examine how improvement occurs. Patients who recover from depressive episodes often show reduced inflammatory markers over time. This suggests that successful treatment is not only shifting neurotransmitters in the brain, but also bringing the immune system back into balance. The return of restored sleep, balanced diet, and activity likely play roles, but therapies themselves may dampen harmful immune signaling directly. Combined, these improvements reflect a system resetting rather than a mood shift alone. Understanding depression as an interaction between inflammatory chemistry and cognitive symptoms expands how we define the disorder. It is no longer accurate to describe it only in terms of sadness or fatigue. It is more like a conversation between body and brain, where immune messengers maintain a background tone of distress that colors thoughts and feelings. This makes sense of why depression produces both physical and psychological symptoms simultaneously. It explains how someone can feel exhausted and achy in ways that don't align with test results, while also wrestling with thought patterns of guilt or hopelessness. Both sides of the condition emerge from the same underlying messages. From a broader scientific perspective, this connection also opens paths for new treatments. Medication research in 2025 includes trials of selective anti-inflammatory drugs as potential depression treatments, particularly for patients showing elevated markers. While results are early, they reinforce that targeting body signals can reshape mind states. Similarly, behavioral interventions tested for physical health outcomes are proving effective for mood symptoms. Structured exercise, often recommended for inflammation reduction, not only improves cardiovascular outcomes, but also reduces depressive symptoms through shared biological pathways. What emerges from this body-mind perspective is a more integrated view of human health. Depression cannot be neatly cleaved into psychological on one side and biological on the other. They are interdependent processes, with inflammation straddling the line. Recognizing that chronic inflammation is both cause and symptom helps unify the picture. Addressing depression effectively requires paying attention not only to thoughts and behaviors, but also to signals traveling through the immune system. This understanding also brings forward a new challenge. If depression is tied to systemic inflammation, then how do hormonal fluctuations within the body influence this system? Stress hormones like cortisol are already implicated in disrupting immune regulation. Reproductive hormone changes are also known to influence vulnerability. These questions draw attention to the underlying hormonal imbalances that shape how depression emerges and why certain periods of life make people more susceptible than others. Hormonal imbalances you don't hear about. Why do some people notice their depression getting worse whenever their hormones shift? It can happen during puberty, postpartum periods, changes in reproductive cycles, or even after prolonged stress. Many expect hormonal changes to mainly affect physical states, things like appetite, weight, or reproductive health. But studies have shown that hormones are also tightly linked to cognitive functions and emotional regulation. What makes this especially important is that the hormones most people associate with depression aren't the only ones involved. It's not just estrogen or testosterone changes. Stress hormones like cortisol play a central role, and their influence on the brain explains many of the so-called hidden symptoms of depression, including fatigue, poor memory, and decision-making difficulties. Cortisol is sometimes referred to as the body's stress alarm. When you face challenges or sudden fear, cortisol rises to help you deal with them. It mobilizes energy, heightens alertness, and prepares the body to respond. In short bursts, that system can be life-saving. But cortisol isn't meant to stay elevated indefinitely. When it does, the results are very different. Instead of sharpening focus, chronic cortisol elevation interferes with brain circuits, particularly in areas like the hippocampus, which handles memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which manages decisions and planning. In people with depression, cortisol rhythms are often disrupted. Levels may stay high long after stress has passed or spike at the wrong times of day, creating a constant internal environment of imbalance. The outcome of this imbalance shows up in fatigue first. When cortisol keeps running on high, your body never fully shuts off its alarm system. Sleep becomes shallow and less restorative, even if it lasts many hours. Instead of energizing the body, rest leaves people feeling depleted. That kind of fatigue can't be explained away by late nights or poor sleep hygiene. It reflects deeper biological cycles, not operating as they should. This is why someone can spend 10 hours in bed and still wake up exhausted. The prolonged presence of stress hormones prevents the rest system from actually restoring energy. Cortisol dysregulation also alters how memory functions. The hippocampus is particularly sensitive to stress hormones. Normally, it integrates new information, stores it, and retrieves it when needed. But under constant exposure to elevated cortisol, the hippocampus struggles to operate. This explains why people with depression often feel foggy or forgetful, even when they try hard to pay attention. The brain isn't failing because of disinterest. It's operating under chemical conditions that reduce efficiency. Everyday examples, forgetting why you walked into a room, or rereading the same sentence multiple times, become more common when cortisol overstays its welcome. Decision-making is the next domain to falter. Choices require support from the prefrontal cortex. This region integrates options, predicts outcomes, and balances risks against rewards. But chronic activation of stress hormones interferes with those processes. Without smooth operation, decisions feel impossible to finalize. Even trivial matters, what snack to buy, what show to watch, seem stuck in indecision. People with depression often describe a paralyzing lack of ability to choose, and science shows that one reason is lower efficiency of these prefrontal networks when flooded with stress signals. These hormonal influences expand our understanding of depression beyond sadness. They provide a reason why symptoms can feel so physical and unrelenting. Fatigue that no amount of sleep fixes. Memory lapses that seem out of character. Difficulty making choices that stretches across professional and personal life. All of these can be traced back to how disrupted cortisol interacts with brain systems. Instead of being a secondary effect, cortisol imbalance is thought to be a contributing driver of how depression disrupts daily functioning. It is important to note that reproductive hormones also shape vulnerability to depression, but that story is more familiar. What many people don't hear about is the direct impact of ongoing cortisol irregularities. Stress exposure rewires endocrine systems. At first, the body handles stress with temporary surges. Over time, repeated stress events change baseline levels, leaving cortisol high even at rest. This altered baseline means the person is carrying, biologically, a sense of constant demand. That biological environment sets the stage for depression to worsen. Looking more closely at fatigue, recurring patterns emerge. People exposed to prolonged stress describe mornings as particularly difficult. Cortisol normally follows a rhythm. It rises in the early morning to help us wake up, then declines during the day to prepare for sleep. In depression, this rhythm is irregular. Sometimes cortisol doesn't rise sharply enough in the morning, leaving people sluggish. Other times, it remains elevated late into the night, preventing deep rest. The lack of clear cycles undermines the natural alternation between energy and recovery. Because of this, fatigue in depression is rarely about the number of sleep hours. It's about the absence of proper alignment between hormonal release and the body's needs. Memory impairment reinforces this point further. Detailed experiments have shown that under conditions of prolonged cortisol exposure, people remember neutral information less effectively, while negative information often sticks too strongly. In other words, people forget neutral daily facts, but vividly remember distressing events or judgments. This bias may explain why people with depression describe their worlds as bleak. The brain, under chronic cortisol pressure, gives preferential storage to negative inputs. Over time, that makes the mental environment even harsher, because positive or neutral experiences fade while critical or painful ones repeat. Decision-making impairments also connect with reward processing. Dopamine supports motivation by attaching value to outcomes. Elevated cortisol weakens dopamine transmission, especially in pathways that anticipate rewards. The depressed brain struggles not only to weigh choices, but also to recognize which choice feels worth pursuing. This produces decision paralysis. If both options carry low anticipated reward, neither feels compelling. Without that push, even small decisions drag out or are avoided entirely. Cortisol dysregulation is not always obvious to patients. Unlike sadness or worry, hormone imbalances aren't consciously felt. but their consequences show consistently across symptoms. Someone may seek medical evaluation for fatigue, memory gaps, or indecisiveness without mentioning mood. Doctors then run standard blood work, which often looks normal since typical tests don't capture cortisol rhythm variations. Without awareness of this link, individuals may feel invalidated when told nothing appears wrong, even as the hormonal cycle underpins their daily struggles. The pattern plays a feedback role as well. Depression raises stress perception, making ordinary challenges feel overwhelming. This activates cortisol further, intensifying its imbalance. The imbalance feeds back into fatigue, memory, and cognition, which in turn cause more stress. The cycle sustains itself. Stress hormones heighten problems that themselves create new stressors. This loop resembles many others in depression: guilt, rumination, withdrawal. But here the driver is biochemical rather than purely cognitive. Addressing hormonal imbalance in depression, therefore, requires both psychological and physiological approaches. Cognitive therapies help reduce exaggerated stress perception, lowering triggers for cortisol release. Structured routines that regulate sleep and waking times reinforce healthier rhythms. Physical activity not only expends stress hormones, but also restores natural cycles of cortisol fluctuation. These interventions don't directly suppress cortisol, but create conditions where the hormone operates closer to its intended rhythm. Recognizing the role of hormonal imbalance also reshapes how patients think about their symptoms. Fatigue, memory loss, and indecision can be easily misinterpreted as personality flaws. Understanding that these are connected to measurable biological cycles reduces self-blame. People begin to see their struggles less as failures of effort and more as outcomes of physiology needing support. This frame is crucial for motivation, recognizing that change is possible when symptoms are grounded in specific biological systems. From a wider perspective, cortisol's role helps explain why depression often feels like both a psychological and physical disorder. Its effects straddle thought and body, energy and memory. While sadness is still part of the condition, the hormone-driven symptoms account for why depressive fatigue and cognitive disruptions remain so stubborn. They are not melted away by positive thinking, because their roots extend into endocrine pathways. This enlarges the map of depression from mood alone to the full integration of brain and hormones. Another point worth emphasizing is the variability across individuals. Not every person with depression displays identical cortisol profiles. Some show elevated levels constantly, while others display timing mismatches more than absolute elevation. This heterogeneity is why researchers hesitate to describe a single hormonal signature for depression. Still, the consistent presence of abnormal rhythms points to cortisol as a key factor across subsets of patients. Future screening may involve more detailed hormone mapping throughout the day rather than one-time lab samples, giving a clearer view of who may benefit from rhythm regulation therapies. The recognition of hormonal imbalance also adds weight to prevention research. If early stress exposures, whether from trauma, long-term pressure, or unstable environments, alter cortisol cycles, then interventions placed early in life may reduce future vulnerability to depression. Teaching regulation strategies in schools, encouraging sleep health, and providing stress coping frameworks could modify the way people's hormone systems respond over time. In this sense, understanding cortisol's contribution shifts focus from just treating depression to reducing risk in the first place. Looking ahead, this hormonal perspective is not meant to replace psychological explanations, but to broaden them. Depression is not solely a story of mood, thought, or neurotransmitters. It is also a story of rhythms written into the body's chemistry. Stress hormones may have evolved to protect us in acute crises, but when they misfire chronically, they become part of what sustains depression. The fatigue, fog, and indecision that seems so difficult to explain fall into place when seen as consequences of persistent hormonal misalignment. Understanding that depression travels through cortisol circuits highlights just how wide its reach can be. These hidden hormonal influences explain why people often mislabel their symptoms and why treatment requires more than willpower. Seeing depression as connected to bodily rhythms reinforces that mental health and physical regulation are never separate. They are intertwined, and the imbalance of one system inevitably affects the other. And just as these hormone disruptions shed light on fatigue, memory lapses, and stalled decisions, they raise another intriguing point: that people who engage in spiritual or existential searching often interpret depression in very different terms, confusing it with what feels like a crisis of meaning rather than recognizing its physical and cognitive signatures. Why spiritual seekers feel it differently. Depressed spiritual seekers often confuse their symptoms with what many traditions describe as the dark night of the soul. Both experiences involve withdrawal, emotional heaviness, and a sense of disconnection from meaning. To someone who approaches life through a spiritual lens, it can feel natural to interpret these states as part of a sacred journey or transformation. But psychologists point out that clinical depression and spiritual struggle, while sometimes appearing similar on the surface, are not the same thing. Understanding the difference is important, because mistaking illness for awakening can delay treatment, while also increasing distress when the expected spiritual growth never arrives. The overlap in appearance starts with isolation. Both depression and spiritual seeking can involve retreat from everyday life, long hours spent in reflection, and a sense of distance from other people. Religious texts across cultures describe seekers withdrawing from social settings and enduring periods of dryness, where meaning feels absent. This description mirrors the way depressed individuals pull back from relationships, avoid responsibilities, and feel disconnected from joy or motivation. From the outside, these two processes look strikingly similar. Someone meditating alone in silence, and someone lying in bed, exhausted, may both appear to be separating themselves from normal life. The crucial distinction lies in what happens alongside that withdrawal. Heavy emotional states are also common to both. A monk might describe emptiness or despair as part of a transformative journey. A person in depression feels emptiness and despair as defining features of the illness. Both individuals might say they see little point in their daily activities or feel detached from the pleasures of the world. This is why the language overlaps so easily. Spiritual seekers sometimes interpret their symptoms as a deepening of their journey, when in some cases what is happening is actually clinical depression reshaping brain chemistry. Without awareness of the differences, the lines blur. Psychologists suggest the key marker is impairment in cognitive and physical functions. In spiritual crisis, people may feel lost or disoriented, but their memory and decision-making usually remain stable. They can still organize daily tasks, even if their emotions feel unsettled. In depression, however, concentration falters and memory lapses grow frequent. Individuals may forget ordinary details, struggle with trivial decisions, and find daily functioning breaking down. These signs indicate cognitive disruptions more than existential transition. Another observable marker is exhaustion. Spiritual seekers facing a dark night often report restlessness or discomfort, but not the level of energy loss seen in clinical depression. In depression, fatigue persists no matter how much rest is taken, creating a physical barrier to action. Consider an example. A person exploring meditation may feel detached from worldly pleasures and start questioning whether their life carries meaning. They may feel sadness but remain able to fulfill work responsibilities, maintain relationships, and recall details of daily interactions. This may reflect existential searching rather than illness. In contrast, a person with depression might feel meaning draining from life as well, but also forget deadlines, lose the ability to concentrate on conversations, and find themselves physically too tired to engage. The overlap in emotional tone hides the differences in functioning. This is why psychologists call for careful attention to whether impairments of memory, energy, and decision-making are present. Confusion also arises because many traditions see suffering as essential to growth. A depressed individual within a spiritual community may be told that their pain indicates deeper progress, not illness. Well-meaning mentors may frame exhaustion and despair as signs that transformation is underway. While that interpretation can feel reassuring at first, it risks leading the person to tolerate symptoms longer and to avoid professional help. When fatigue, cognitive disruption, and irritability linger for months or years, the explanation of spiritual growth fails to capture the reality of depression's grip. Without intervention, the condition may worsen until functioning is severely impaired. Another complexity is the stigma surrounding mental health in some faiths. Believers may find it easier to describe depression as a spiritual test than as a psychological condition. Talking about a dark night of the soul may bring validation from peers, while admitting to depression may bring judgment or misunderstanding. This social context reinforces the blending of illness with spirituality. In research interviews, individuals often explain that framing their experiences spiritually made them feel less ashamed. While comforting, This interpretation sometimes blocks recognition of the medical aspects. One way psychologists recommend distinguishing between experiences is looking at trajectory. Spiritual crises, while painful, often reveal movement toward renewed purpose. Over time, individuals usually emerge with clearer values, deeper compassion, or broader perspectives. Depression tends not to bring such movement. Instead, it sustains cycles of hopelessness, guilt, and withdrawal. Months can pass with little change, or symptoms can worsen. When a person feels stuck in repetitive loops with no glimmers of insight or direction, the pattern aligns more closely with depression. Assessing change over time highlights whether an experience is developmental or pathological. The recognition of physical symptoms also provides strong evidence. Spiritual seekers often describe emotional intensity, grief, confusion, yearning, but they rarely present with headaches, muscle tension, or digestive issues solely from seeking. Depression, on the other hand, commonly involves physical exhaustion, altered appetite, and bodily discomfort without clear medical cause. If emotional pain is accompanied by widespread fatigue and constant aches, the experience is more consistent with clinical depression. Recognizing these markers helps avoid mistaking illness for spiritual passage. Identity plays a role here too. In spiritual crisis, a person may question parts of themselves, but remains aware that the struggle is centered on belief, purpose, and connection with the transcendent. In depression, the questioning extends into self-worth broadly. The narrative often becomes, "I am worthless," rather than, "I am searching." This distinction matters. A crisis of meaning is still stable in its sense of personal value, while depression erases it. People who report feelings of defectiveness across all areas of life are experiencing a different process than those questioning their path towards spiritual purpose. This distinction has practical consequences for treatment. A spiritual seeker who mistakes depression for a sacred journey may neglect medical care. They may double their efforts in meditation, prayer, or ritual, expecting enlightenment to eventually come. When it doesn't, despair deepens. Psychologists emphasize the importance of combining approaches. Someone can continue in their spiritual searching while also addressing depression medically or therapeutically. The two are not mutually exclusive. But separating what is illness from what is search ensures the correct forms of support are provided. It also matters because depression can distort spiritual life itself. Rumination easily disguises itself as reflection. Brooding on guilt or meaninglessness can appear like prayerful thought, when it is actually a loop draining energy and reinforcing negativity. People often report thinking they are engaging in discipline when they are actually reinforcing depressive cycles. Differentiating reflection that produces direction from rumination that consumes energy helps clarify what belongs to spiritual struggle and what belongs to illness. For clinicians, conversations about spirituality provide both challenges and opportunities. Some patients resist framing their experience as illness because they find comfort in seeing it as part of the soul's journey. Others may find relief in learning that depression explains their exhaustion and cognitive lapses, separating those from spiritual searching. Sensitive exploration is needed to respect belief while clarifying symptoms. The focus is not on erasing spirituality, but on showing how depression changes functioning in consistent, biological ways that spiritual crises alone typically do not. On the research side, there is growing interest in how meaning-making influences depression. Studies show that strong personal narratives, whether religious or secular, can buffer distress. Yet these narratives cannot prevent biological symptoms from surfacing. They may soften interpretation, but they do not erase fatigue, memory impairment, or decision paralysis. This reinforces psychologists' view that depression requires integrated treatment, attention to beliefs, but also attention to biology. From the perspective of those experiencing it, the overlap can feel confusing, even destabilizing. People often say, "I don't know if I'm growing or dying inside." That uncertainty itself deepens despair. Recognizing the cognitive and physical dimensions of depression helps provide clarity. If someone is both yearning for meaning and consistently unable to concentrate, remember, or stay awake, the picture likely includes illness. Acknowledging both aspects reduces confusion and opens paths to support on multiple levels. Understanding the difference matters at the communal level as well. Faith groups often find themselves as first responders to people in crisis. If leaders assume all despair within their communities is purely spiritual, they risk overlooking depression. Learning the markers, cognitive disruption and physical exhaustion, equips them to better guide members toward professional care while still offering spiritual support. Rather than replacing spiritual interpretation, this complementary understanding enriches care. What emerges from examining these overlaps is a picture of depression as both easily mistaken and uniquely identifiable. It channels its symptoms through withdrawal and despair, which look like spiritual searching from the outside. But it leaves fingerprints no ordinary crisis of meaning does. Memory lapses, indecision, unrelenting fatigue. These signatures reveal illness within the search. Recognizing them provides opportunity for clarity, compassion, and more accurate care. When stretched further, this distinction also tells us something larger about depression itself. It demonstrates that the disorder doesn't only mimic sadness or anger, but can even imitate sacred experience. This mimicry shows how deeply depression reaches into human interpretation, bending even spiritual frameworks into shapes that hide its presence. Seeing through that disguise allows people to find support for both their faith journey and their health needs. And as unusual as it may sound, the very tools many use to share their struggles, like humor, storytelling, even memes, can also provide ways of reframing these distortions, making overwhelming thoughts a bit more manageable. Humor and psychology, a self-awareness tool. Why do memes about depression feel so strangely relatable? It might sound odd to think of a serious condition being paired with a punchline or a cartoon image, but millions of people share and laugh at these posts every day. It's not because depression is funny. It's because humor provides a small shift in how thoughts are seen. For those who live with depression's distortions, jokes and memes often describe the thoughts in exaggerated, absurd, or blunt ways that highlight how illogical they can actually be. Instead of drowning in those thoughts, humor lets someone step outside them, if only briefly, and recognize them as patterns rather than personal truths. Psychologists are careful to point out that humor is not a cure. Sharing a relatable meme won't replace therapy or suddenly restore motivation. But humor does something valuable. It reframes depressive thought loops in a way that makes reflection less paralyzing. In other words, laughter creates a space where it's possible to look at the distortion without being taken over by it. That sliver of distance can turn what feels like suffocating self-blame into something recognizable as a pattern. And when people begin seeing patterns, they regain the option to question them. Humor doesn't erase depression, but it pokes holes in its most rigid narratives. The framework of humor as a coping tool fits with research on cognitive distortions. We've seen how negative thoughts in depression often become automatic habits. These thoughts repeat until they feel true. When someone jokes about depression by presenting those thoughts in a ridiculous way, like, "My brain wakes me up at 3 a.m. to remind me of something embarrassing from middle school," it mirrors the absurdity of the distortion itself. A person reading it may laugh, not just at the joke, but at the recognition that their brain does the same thing. The laughter doesn't change the memory or solve the loop, but it acknowledges that the loop isn't reality, just a repeated mechanical glitch. Humor can also reduce isolation. Depression convinces people that they are unique in their flaws or failures. Seeing thousands of strangers online laughing about the same intrusive thoughts or same sense of exhaustion proves otherwise. That sense of universality turns misery into something shared. Someone scrolling through memes during a sleepless night might suddenly feel understood in a way that formal conversations rarely achieve. They realize their experiences aren't strange or shameful. They are symptoms that many others interpret the same way. That recognition, offered through humor, can soften loneliness. Importantly, humor reduces the fear around talking about depression. Many people hesitate to discuss their inner struggles because they worry about appearing weak, fragile, or broken. Humor lowers the barrier. Saying, "I laughed at this meme about cancelling plans because of imaginary scenarios in my head," feels lighter than saying, "I struggle with social anxiety and depressive rumination." Both reveal the same symptom, but one feels more approachable. Friends who wouldn't know how to respond to the serious disclosure might still laugh along with the meme, opening space for conversation. That conversation can later grow more serious if needed. Humor acts as the bridge. Psychologists describe humor as a reframe, taking a heavy situation and presenting it through an alternative perspective. The depressive brain usually delivers thoughts with certainty. "I am worthless," "I will always fail," or "nothing matters." Humor inserts exaggeration or twist into that certainty, exposing the distortion's ridiculous edge. For example, instead of thinking, I will never accomplish anything. A joke might say, Step 1. Sit down to be productive. Step 2. Accidentally stare at the wall for 3 hours. Step 3. Cry. Step 4. Victory. The humor exaggerates the paralysis until it becomes visible as a pattern. This visibility makes people more able to question the underlying distortion. But humor is not always straightforward. For some, self-deprecating jokes can reinforce negative beliefs. When someone constantly jokes about being useless or unworthy, friends may laugh, but the person may also be rehearsing the distortion further. The distinction lies in whether humor creates distance or embeds the thought more deeply. If a person laughs and recognizes their distortion as overblown, humor helps. If the joke feels like just another opportunity to tell themselves they're worthless, humor backfires. In other words, humor as a tool works best when it builds awareness, not when it repeats a script of self-attack. There's also the matter of timing. During the heaviest points of depression, humor may not penetrate at all. Memes or jokes might feel empty or irritating, highlighting the gap between other people's laughter and one's own numbness. At this point, humor may not be useful, and expecting it to be could create guilt. Why can't I even laugh at this? Psychologists recommend seeing humor as one of many tools, not a universal fix. On days when it clicks, it provides relief and insight. On other days, different strategies may be needed. Recognizing its limits prevents false expectations. When humor does work, the effect is lasting not because the joke remains funny forever, but because it opens the possibility of seeing distorted thoughts as distorted. Take the example of memes about procrastination. A depressed individual may see themselves in the jokes and laugh at their tendency to avoid tasks. Once they realize procrastination is part of depression's pattern, they may feel more prepared to discuss it in therapy. Humor begins the process of depersonalizing the symptom. Instead of, I am incompetent for procrastinating, it becomes, I'm experiencing the procrastination symptom that many others have too. That reframing changes shame into recognition, which is a foundation for change. Another key role of humor is lowering anxiety. Public stigma around depression creates tension whenever the subject arises. Jokes can lighten that tension, making discussions safer in workplaces, classrooms, or friend groups. For instance, colleagues might share light-hearted posts about being emotionally done by Tuesday, sparking laughter, but also honesty about stress and burnout. The laughter gives permission to talk, where silence might otherwise prevail. Behind the humor, awareness spreads quietly. The spread of memes also reflects how culture processes mental health collectively. A century ago, depression might have been described through poetry or diary entries. In 2025, it is described through quick images and captions, reaching millions instantly. The format matches the attention patterns of modern media: brief, relatable, and endlessly shareable. Though compact, these memes serve the same function stories always have: to translate individual pain into communal recognition. The humor softens the telling without nullifying the reality behind it. Humor as a self-awareness tool highlights that depression is not only about internal suffering, but also about shared communication. People don't just laugh alone at depression-related jokes, they share them with friends, signaling solidarity. That act of sharing is a reminder that even under the weight of distorted thinking, people reach out. Sharing a laugh becomes a disguised statement. I feel this too. Over time, these small signals weave a surprising support network. From the clinical perspective, humor's benefit is clear when it becomes part of reframing strategies. Therapists may ask patients to practice identifying distortions, not only logically, but playfully. By exaggerating a distortion until it sounds absurd, the patient learns to see it for what it is: a habit loop, not truth. Workshops incorporating humorous exercises show higher engagement because the process feels less burdensome. Making light of the distortion does not trivialize the pain. It makes the pain less rigid, giving space for flexibility. Humor also challenges depression's monopoly on narrative. Without interruption, the depressed brain dominates with bleak stories. Humor interrupts that flow with alternative versions of events. It may not show the absolute truth, but it shows that more than one interpretation exists. That reminder alone weakens the conviction depression tries to impose. If an alternative perspective is possible, then depression's story is not absolute. That seed of doubt allows therapeutic work to take root more easily. Ultimately, humor works by creating small cracks in the walls built by depression's distortions. Through recognition, exaggeration, or shared laughter, It gives individuals distance from thoughts that otherwise control them. No meme or joke will dissolve depression, but each one can provide a moment of perspective that accumulates over time. People learn to recognize patterns as patterns, not truths. They learn that they are not alone in their struggles. And they learn that even under mental fog, laughter remains accessible. Understanding humor this way reframes it from a distraction into a tool. Not a cure, not a replacement for therapy, but a practice that lightens the weight of reflection just enough for change to feel possible. Depression may anchor people in guilt, rumination, and fatigue, but humor reminds them that those anchors are not permanent. That reminder, tiny as it seems, can be powerful. And from there, the question shifts toward another pressing concern. If humor helps reduce distortion, what practical tools do we actually have to break these loops and restore flexibility in daily life? What we can actually do about it? With all these hidden patterns, is there hope? That's a serious question, because learning about how depression quietly reshapes memory, irritability, motivation, and even physical health can leave people wondering if there is any way to break out of these cycles. Awareness helps. It makes sense of what might have otherwise felt random or shameful. But awareness by itself is not enough. People can recognize their rumination, or even see their guilt spiraling out of proportion, and still feel powerless to interrupt the cycle. That is why the evidence-based strategies developed in psychology and neuroscience focus not only on recognizing depression's distortions, but on disrupting and retraining the processes behind them. One of the most widely studied approaches is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. At its core, CBT is not just about thinking positively, but about identifying and clarifying the automatic thoughts that drive distortions. Take the example of personalization. If someone assumes, "It's my fault," every time another person frowns, CBT doesn't ask them to simply replace that thought with a cheerful one. Instead, a therapist works with them to slow down the process, to spot the distortion as it happens, and to test it against evidence. Was the frown actually caused by them, or could it have come from the other person's day? Practicing this distinction repeatedly helps weaken the habit loop of assuming guilt every time. By breaking down distorted interpretations, CBT gently rewires the linkage between events and conclusions. An important feature of CBT is its structured nature. Patients don't work with vague encouragements alone. They often use thought records, review specific patterns like catastrophizing or black and white thinking, and practice generating alternative explanations. This evidence-based approach matters because it teaches the brain to develop competing mental grooves. Earlier we saw how distortions repeat until they feel true. CBT deliberately rehearses accurate thoughts with enough repetition to carve new grooves that can compete with the old ones. Over time, patients report being able to catch distortions earlier and with less emotional intensity. Mindfulness strategies provide another proven tool. While CBT challenges distortions directly, mindfulness changes the relationship to thoughts altogether. Depression thrives when thoughts arrive and are treated as facts. By practicing mindfulness, individuals learn to notice when a thought appears. "I'm worthless," for example, while labeling it as merely a thought. Instead of identifying with it, they allow it to rise and pass. This doesn't mean ignoring thoughts entirely. It means acknowledging their presence without becoming entangled. At first, mindfulness exercises can feel simple, focusing on breathing, observing sensations, or naming thoughts as they arise. But the real goal is to train attention. Depression hijacks attention with rumination loops. Mindfulness teaches attention to return to the present moment repeatedly, giving the brain practice in redirecting itself away from loops. With time, this practice strengthens attention's flexibility, making it easier to shift focus not only during meditation, but also in everyday contexts, such as stepping away from cycles of regret or worry that normally consume the mind. Evidence from clinical research supports the effectiveness of these methods. Patients practicing mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which combines CBT principles with mindfulness routines, experience lower relapse rates after recovering from depressive episodes. The reason seems to be that rumination, one of the strongest predictors of relapse, is directly addressed. Rather than leaving patients to hope they don't slip back into cycles, mindfulness equips them with a skill set to recognize those first loops and redirect attention. This is one way science addresses the fact that awareness of symptoms is important, but not protective by itself. Another line of intervention focuses, specifically, on rumination interruption. Since rumination drains working memory, and prevents progress on decision-making. Psychologists design behavioral experiments to break the loop. For example, a common exercise is scheduling a worry period. Instead of ruminating throughout the day, patients are encouraged to postpone their negative loops to a specific 20-minute window. The technique sounds counterintuitive, but it reduces rumination's constant intrusion. By promising the mind it can revisit its worries later, cognitive space clears temporarily. Over weeks, this practice trains the brain to realize that rumination can be delayed and does not need to hijack every moment. Other strategies emphasize behavioral activation. Depression convinces people to withdraw from activities, but withdrawal reduces exposure to positive reinforcement, worsening mood. Behavioral activation counters this by committing individuals to specific, modest activities, chosen deliberately to generate small but rewarding experiences. These might be simple acts like walking around the block, calling a friend, or cooking a meal. While they seem minor, they have measurable impact, because they reintroduce the brain to feedback loops that encourage engagement instead of retreat. They also provide real-world evidence against distortions. "I always fail" loses some weight once the person completes tasks they thought impossible in their current state. These approaches highlight a broader principle. Depression distorts perception of ability, motivation, and worth, but structured practice pushes the brain toward recalibration. Skills such as challenging thoughts, observing without attachment, postponing ruminations, and taking action despite fatigue collectively restore mental flexibility. And that flexibility matters because depression is often most destructive when it locks the brain into rigid cycles of guilt, looping thoughts, or indecision. Tools that break rigidity create openings for progress where none seemed possible. The challenge, however, is that these tools require persistence. Depression itself sabotages motivation, so practicing cognitive exercises or mindfulness may feel pointless at first. This is why therapists emphasize gradual practice. Tasks are broken into manageable steps, celebrated when completed, and repeated until they become habits. Over time, small rehearsals accumulate into major improvements. For instance, someone who first learns to identify one distortion per week may eventually catch them daily, reducing their influence significantly. It's also important to emphasize that support matters. Self-guided efforts can be beneficial, but structured therapy with a professional often strengthens outcomes. Therapists not only introduce the techniques, but hold patients accountable, provide encouragement when exercises feel impossible, and adapt strategies based on progress. Without that structure, many people give up prematurely. With it, skills are sustained and refined over longer periods. Beyond therapy, there are also daily practices people can use as adjuncts. Physical activity is consistently shown to improve mood, not simply because of distraction, but because of biochemical changes. Exercise increases neurotransmitter availability and improves stress regulation, reducing some of the imbalances we discussed earlier in cortisol rhythms. Consistent sleep patterns reinforce circadian cycles, helping to reduce fatigue. Balanced nutrition supports immune health, thereby moderating inflammation that contributes to depressive symptoms. Each of these habits may seem simple, but together they align the body's systems more effectively, supporting the psychological tools already being used. Technology is being woven into interventions as well. Apps that track mood and prompt mindfulness reminders help bring awareness into everyday life. Some programs even detect rumination patterns through journaling or typing style and suggest exercises immediately. While not replacements for therapy, these tools extend clinical strategies into real-time settings, offering patients opportunities to practice throughout the day rather than only during sessions. Another promising practice is compassion training. Depression often couples self-blame with harsh criticism. Exercises in self-compassion work against this by rehearsing kinder language toward the self. Instead of "I failed and I'm useless," patients practice saying, "I failed, and that feels hard, but mistakes are part of being human." Repetition here matters as much as with distortions. With enough practice, self-compassion becomes the automatic alternative to self-condemnation, interrupting guilt's grip. This tool is increasingly added into cognitive therapies as therapists recognize that disruption of self-blame requires not only correction but replacement. It may help to think of depression as a series of traps: ruminative loops, distortions, withdrawal, and fatigue. Each tool, CBT, mindfulness, behavioral activation, compassion training, acts not as an escape hatch but as a ladder built slowly, rung by rung. A person doesn't leap out of the trap. They climb out over time, practicing each rung until they can support themselves on new ground. Evidence shows these ladders are sturdy, even if climbing them feels slow. The message from the research is that hope lies in practice rather than recognition alone. Depression persuades the mind that change is impossible, but evidence-based strategies demonstrate the opposite. Repetition, structure, and support reshape the very systems depression distorts. Tools don't erase sadness overnight, but they soften its loops, rewire attention, and restore flexibility to thought. This flexible state doesn't eliminate depression's risk, but it makes recovery more sustainable and prepares the brain to resist relapse when future stresses arise. And once we see that structured tools can rewrite depression's rigid patterns, it raises another exciting question. What if treatments in the future could go beyond self-report and therapy and use technology to track and tailor interventions in real time, much like medical devices already monitor physical health? That possibility is already being explored in new research, and it could transform how depression is treated in the years ahead. The future of depression treatment. Could wearables and brain scans soon track depressive symptoms the same way a fitness tracker logs steps or heart rate? That question is starting to move from speculation to possibility. For decades, depression has been monitored almost entirely through self-reporting. A doctor or therapist asks you how you've been feeling. You try to describe your mood and behavior, and treatment is designed based on those descriptions. The problem is that human memory is messy, and depression itself interferes with how accurately people recall details about their sleep, concentration, or fatigue. A week later, the same patient might present a completely different description because their mood colored their memory of past days. Depending only on self-report creates gaps in accuracy, which then shapes treatment in less precise ways. The current system works more like snapshots than live streaming. Clinicians get brief windows into how a person felt during specific appointments. If symptoms fluctuate daily or even hourly, those windows don't capture the full picture. Someone could present as relatively stable on a Monday morning appointment after a decent weekend, while several nights of insomnia the previous week never appear in the record. In other branches of healthcare, this would seem outdated. Imagine doctors monitoring diabetes purely by asking patients to remember their blood sugar spikes over the last month instead of using glucose monitors. Yet this is close to how depression care has traditionally operated. Emerging research in 2025 suggests the situation may be changing. Scientists are building tools to track depression's signatures in real time, using both brain-based measures and wearable devices that quietly collect data while people go about their lives. Instead of asking a patient to recall when they felt hopeless, restless, or fatigued, devices could notice the subtle bodily changes linked to those states. This includes disrupted sleep rhythms, altered activity levels, shifts in speech or typing patterns, and even neural signals tied to rumination or guilt. In theory, the end result could be a personalized profile of how depression unfolds in real time, showing exactly when and how symptoms intensify. One of the most promising directions involves portable sleep and circadian rhythm tracking. Depression alters energy cycles and often creates disrupted cortisol timing. Wrist devices can already record movement, sleep stage approximations, and heart rate variability. Researchers are now correlating those signals with depressive symptom patterns, identifying how early morning restlessness, nightly wakings, or delayed sleep cycles predict worsening mood. Instead of relying on someone's groggy memory of restless nights, the wearable builds a detailed record. These data streams could show clinicians when restorative sleep failed, when daily activity dropped, or when patterns shift toward relapse. Sleep and circadian markers may provide one of the clearest ongoing signatures of depressive physiology outside the brain itself. Voice analysis is another line of exploration. Depression often changes how people speak. Slowed rate, lowered volume, and reduced variation in pitch are commonly observed. Subtle hesitations or longer pauses in sentences may also mark cognitive fatigue. Algorithms can detect these shifts automatically, sometimes before people consciously notice them. Pilot trials test microphone-equipped devices or phone apps that monitor voice during routine calls or diary recordings. Embedded algorithms then flag when tone or pace aligns with depressive markers. The idea is not that anyone listens in, but that automatic measurements provide one more layer of data on state changes. Typing behavior offers similar clues. When someone is fatigued or cognitively overloaded, the way they interact with a keyboard shifts. Typing speed slows, error rates rise, and pauses grow longer. Secure monitoring can detect those rhythms through smartphones or computers, allowing recognition of depressive lapses in working memory and concentration as they naturally occur. For example, someone composing an email may backspace repeatedly or stop mid-sentence. Instead of calling this laziness or distraction, systems could mark it as evidence of impaired attention capacity, helping explain why the person feels so stuck. Brain-based monitoring adds another crucial layer. Advanced imaging remains expensive and impractical for daily use, but researchers highlight that consistent neural signatures for depression offer a proof of concept. Misfiring guilt circuits and persistent rumination activity could provide biomarkers visible during scan sessions, used both for diagnosis and for tracking treatment response. While we are not yet at the point of portable brain scanners, the markers discovered create baselines researchers can attempt to approximate with less invasive tools, like EEG headbands. These portable devices track electrical activity across the scalp, offering insights about attention, sleep quality, and rumination-like patterns of default network activation. The accuracy is not equal to large-scale imaging, but it provides real-time feedback more accessible to everyday life. The hope of combining data streams is strong. A patient might wear a device monitoring activity, heart rate, and sleep, while also using an app logging speech rhythm and a periodic EEG headset session. Together, these create continuous, layered insights. Instead of a therapist asking, "How have you been this week?" a dashboard could display objective records. Sleep disruption spiked midweek, speech slowed, and cognitive lapses increased. Interventions could then be timed precisely. If early warning signs predict a spiral, a clinician might recommend increasing therapy sessions, adjusting medication, or initiating behavioral strategies right then, rather than waiting until the next scheduled appointment when symptoms may have worsened. This approach is called personalized intervention, since depression manifests in diverse ways. Irritability in one, fatigue in another, pain in a third. It resists a one-size-fits-all treatment. Real-time monitoring helps match interventions to the patterns most relevant for each person. Consider two patients, one whose depression is strongly tied to sleep disruption, the other whose depression intensifies through rumination cycles captured in slowed speech. Wearable and neural data could help identify which therapy strategy should be emphasized. Cognitive approaches for the rumination-dominated pattern. Rhythm repair strategies for the sleep-driven profile. Each patient receives treatment matched to their tracked symptoms instead of to average models. There are challenges. Devices must protect privacy, ensuring sensitive data about voice, typing, or brain activity remains secure. False signals are also possible. For instance, a slowed voice pattern might occur from fatigue unrelated to depression. Researchers must refine algorithms to avoid overpathologizing normal fluctuations. Another challenge is accessibility. High-tech devices risk widening healthcare gaps, if only available to wealthier patients. Developers argue that as the technology matures, costs will lower the same way fitness wearables became widely affordable in just a decade. Despite these barriers, the potential benefits remain significant. Depression treatment today often lags behind symptoms. Patients commonly wait until they recognize severe downturns before seeking help, and by then relapse may be entrenched. Continuous monitoring could warn patients and clinicians much earlier, offering a preventive rather than reactive approach. For example, data might show a steady accumulation of sleep fragmentation and reduced daily activity over 2 weeks. A clinician could then intervene before the full depressive episode blooms, potentially preventing a hospital admission or major disruption to work and relationships. This also addresses one of the most frustrating parts of current treatment: trial and error. Many patients cycle through medications, therapies, and lifestyle changes before finding combinations that work. Real-time monitoring shortens that process by showing which interventions shift markers meaningfully. If a medication improves sleep quality and increases activity within 2 weeks, both patient and clinician can see the change, even if subjective mood hasn't caught up yet. Conversely, if markers remain unchanged, adjustments can be made quickly rather than waiting 3 months to observe outcome. In population health, these tools could transform research as well. Large data sets collected from wearables allow scientists to map depression patterns more precisely. They could identify subtypes marked by distinct clusters of disrupted sleep, altered voice, or neural rhythm changes. With refined subtypes, treatment guidelines could shift away from broad diagnostic categories toward personalized roadmaps. Instead of assuming everyone with depression responds to similar interventions, research may show predictable matches between biological markers and effective therapies. For patients, the impact goes beyond science. Seeing mood tracked alongside concrete biological data validates the reality of symptoms. Much of depression's stigma comes from the perception that it cannot be measured, unlike other illnesses. If devices show disrupted rhythms, altered attention markers, and neurological signatures, patients can point to tangible evidence of their condition. This validation not only aids self-understanding, but also helps reduce stigma in workplaces, families, and communities that have long struggled to see depression as more than emotion. As with any emerging technology, optimism has to be balanced with caution. Monitoring systems can never replace human care. They can provide early warnings, feedback, and personalized suggestions, but interpreting those signals still requires the expertise of clinicians who understand context and nuance. A device can show escalating risk, but a therapist is needed to translate that signal into compassionate and practical action. The future of depression treatment will almost certainly involve blended approaches. Technology identifying windows of risk in real time, with human providers guiding individuals through evidence-based responses. The work happening now shows that psychiatry is moving from broad impressions toward tailored, measurable strategies. Real-time monitoring and neural signatures do not make depression simple, but they make it visible in ways that were not possible before. The illness that once hid behind subjective accounts is leaving clearer traces in data streams. And while these tools are still being refined, the possibility that depressive episodes could soon be tracked, predicted, and even prevented marks a turning point. It suggests a future where care adjusts to moment-by-moment needs, and where treatment feels more like continuous support than intermittent rescue. Depression isn't only about feeling sad. It's a network of distortions that shape thoughts, drain energy, and even affect the body's basic systems. Recognizing these hidden signs matters, because without that recognition, they are too easily mistaken for personality flaws or simple stress. Awareness gives people a way to catch patterns like rumination and self-blame before they take over completely. It also calls for compassion, both toward yourself and others who may be struggling quietly. Share what you've learned, reflect on your own thought patterns, and encourage seeking guidance from science as well as personal growth practices.